Far out in the freezing waters of the North Sea, beyond the shipping routes of muggles and the safer pathways of wizarding travel, there stands a fortress that generations learned to fear more than death itself. Azkaban was not simply a prison. It was a place where hope slowly unraveled, where memories turned poisonous, and where silence itself seemed alive within the stone walls. Tonight, we will walk through the hidden history of that terrible island. From the dark wizard who first built its halls, to the prisoners who vanished behind its iron doors, to the creatures that fed upon despair beneath the endless sound of the sea. Long before Azkaban became the most feared prison in the wizarding world, the island existed alone beneath cold northern skies, surrounded by dark waters that sailors learned to avoid without entirely understanding why. It stood far out in the North Sea, where storms gathered with unusual frequency and thick curtains of grey fog drifted endlessly across the waves. Even among magical communities, maps of the region were strangely inconsistent. Some charts marked empty ocean where the island should have been. Others showed jagged black rocks surrounded by warnings, written in faded ink by frightened hands no longer living. The earliest accounts came not from wizards, but from Muggle sailors who vanished while crossing northern trade routes. Entire crews disappeared without explanation. Ships were sometimes discovered weeks later, drifting silently through the fog, with sails torn and ropes hanging loose in the wind. There were no signs of battle, no blood, no bodies, just abandoned vessels rocking gently upon freezing water, as though their crews had stepped calmly into the sea. Stories spread slowly through coastal villages in Scotland and northern Europe. Fishermen spoke of hearing distant screaming over the waves at night. Others claimed they saw lights burning far out beyond the mist, where no island should have existed. Some described dark figures standing motionless along unseen cliffs, before disappearing whenever ships turned toward them. The stories changed with each telling, but one detail remained constant. Those who deliberately searched for the island rarely returned. The magical world was aware of these rumors, though the Ministry of Magic preferred not to investigate them too closely. During those centuries, wizarding governments across Europe were fragile things, still recovering from repeated magical conflicts and struggling to maintain secrecy from an increasingly organized non-magical world. Dangerous places were often ignored if they could be avoided. The Northern Island became one more shadow, left undisturbed beyond the edges of polite magical society. Yet the island was not empty. Sometime during the 15th century, a dark wizard named Acrisdis made the island his home. Very little is known about where he came from. Even centuries later, magical historians could uncover almost nothing about his childhood, family, or education. It was as though he had appeared fully formed from the darkness itself. The few surviving descriptions painted a deeply unsettling portrait. He was believed to be immensely skilled in obscure and ancient branches of magic, particularly those involving psychological torment, illusion, and emotional manipulation. Unlike many dark wizards who sought power openly, Acrisdis seemed to desire isolation above all else. He did not gather followers. He did not attempt conquest. Instead, he withdrew from the world entirely and transformed the lonely northern island into something terrible. The fortress he built rose directly from black stone cliffs overlooking the sea. Tall, narrow towers clawed upward into the sky like skeletal fingers, their windows little more than dark slits against endless grey clouds. The structure itself seemed designed less for defense than for oppression. Endless corridors twisted inward at unnatural angles. Staircases led nowhere before doubling back upon themselves. Doors opened into chambers too large to fit within the outer walls. Even the air inside the fortress carried a strange heaviness, as though the island itself resisted the presence of living things. Ecrizdis protected the island with powerful concealment enchantments, unlike anything the Ministry had previously encountered. Muggle sailors were driven away by storms and confusion. Wizarding travelers found their navigation spells failing as they approached the surrounding waters. Compasses spun aimlessly. Apparition became impossible. Brooms lost direction within the fog. But despite these protections, people continued disappearing. The truth, when it finally emerged centuries later, was far worse than even the darkest rumors imagined. Ecrizdis had been luring Muggles to the island deliberately. Some were shipwreck survivors, drawn toward false lights along the cliffs. Others were travelers, manipulated through magical influence or confusion spells. Once inside the fortress, they became prisoners in experiments devoted entirely to suffering and fear. No complete record of Ecrizdis' activities survived. Perhaps that was mercy. But the Ministry officials who eventually explored the fortress discovered evidence enough to horrify even seasoned aurors. Hidden chambers showed signs of prolonged imprisonment. Certain rooms still carried traces of curses so violent that the stone itself seemed permanently stained by them. Some walls echoed faintly with screams whenever touched by magic. And yet even Ecrizdis was not the most terrifying thing upon the island. The creatures arrived gradually. No one knows exactly when the first Dementors appeared near the fortress. Some magical scholars later theorized that Ecrizdis himself may have created conditions that attracted them naturally. Others believed he discovered them already, lingering within hidden corners of the world, and intentionally gathered them to the island. Whatever the truth, the creatures multiplied slowly around the fortress over many decades, until the island became saturated with their presence. The effects spread outward into the surrounding sea. Sailors approaching the waters near the island reported overwhelming despair before they ever glimpsed land. Happy memories faded suddenly from their minds. Men who had spent entire lifetimes at sea found themselves unable to remember why life mattered at all. Some abandoned ships willingly, stepping into freezing water without resistance while their companions watched in helpless horror. Even the weather around the island seemed to change beneath the influence of the Dementors. The air grew unnaturally cold. Fog thickened across the sea. Sunlight rarely reached the cliffs surrounding the fortress. Storms gathered more frequently, lingering for days above the black towers, while waves crashed endlessly against stone. Inside the fortress itself, the atmosphere became something beyond ordinary fear. The Dementors drifted soundlessly through corridors and chambers, feeding upon the despair generated by Ecrizdis' victims. Over time, it became impossible to tell where the suffering ended and the creatures began. The island itself felt alive with misery. For centuries, the magical world remained mostly ignorant of what truly existed there. Ships disappeared. Rumors spread. The northern waters remained avoided. But the island stayed hidden behind Ecrizdis' enchantments and the natural terror surrounding the place. Then, sometime near the end of Ecrizdis' life, the concealment spells began to fail. Some historians believe his death weakened the enchantments holding the island hidden. Others suspect age and isolation simply eroded magic that had once been maintained constantly by its creator. Whatever the cause, the fog surrounding the island shifted enough for Ministry officials to finally locate the fortress. The first expedition arrived cautiously, expecting perhaps a rogue wizard's hideout or abandoned ruins. Instead, they found a nightmare. the fortress still stood silent against the sea, its towers dark beneath low clouds. Dementors drifted through broken corridors in enormous numbers. The interior smelled of salt water, mold, and something older beneath both. Some members of the expedition reportedly broke down almost immediately upon entering, overcome by waves of despair so intense they could barely continue walking. What they discovered inside was carefully hidden from the wider wizarding public for generations. The ministry sealed records describing many parts of the fortress entirely. Even among senior officials, there were whispers that some chambers should never have been entered at all. Several members of the original expedition never fully recovered from the experience. One retired from magical service immediately afterward and reportedly refused ever again to speak the island's name aloud. Yet despite everything they found, despite the horrors embedded within the stone itself, the ministry made a decision that would shape the future of wizarding Britain for centuries. They chose not to destroy the fortress. Instead, they looked upon the isolated island, the impossible escape routes, the terrifying Dementors already inhabiting the place, and saw something useful. They saw a prison. And far out beyond the mainland, beneath cold skies and endless drifting fog, Azkaban waited silently for its first prisoners to arrive. By the time the Ministry of Magic first entered the northern fortress, Ecrizdis himself was already dead. No body was ever officially recovered, though several ministry records hinted that something had indeed been found deep within the highest chambers of the island. Whatever remained there was removed quietly and never described publicly. In the years that followed, even senior ministry officials avoided discussing the matter directly. It was easier, perhaps, to let the wizard vanish into rumor than confront the reality of what kind of man could create such a place. And yet traces of him lingered everywhere. The fortress carried the feeling of a mind that had spent decades detached from ordinary humanity. Even long after his death, certain rooms seemed shaped by deliberate cruelty rather than practical design. Corridors narrowed unexpectedly before opening into enormous circular chambers, with ceilings so high they disappeared into darkness. Staircases twisted in spirals that left visitors disoriented. Some doors opened only after long periods of silence, as though the castle itself were listening. The ministry expedition moved carefully through the structure during those first days, protected by Patronus charms that flickered silver through the dim corridors. The Dementors did not attack them directly, but neither did they retreat. They drifted slowly through the fortress, like silent scavengers disturbed during feeding. Several members of the expedition later described an overwhelming sensation that the island itself was watching them. The lower levels of the fortress were the worst. The air there felt wet and stale, heavy with salt and decay. Rusted chains still hung from walls in certain chambers. Some rooms contained strange symbols carved directly into stone floors, circles and markings associated with ancient magical rituals long outlawed throughout Europe. Other chambers appeared almost empty at first glance, until torchlight revealed scratches covering the walls from floor to ceiling. Human scratches. Evidence suggested that Ecrizdis had rarely used direct violence himself. Instead, he seemed fascinated by fear as a magical force. His victims were trapped, isolated, and psychologically broken over long periods of time. Some chambers amplified sound unnaturally, causing distant screams to echo endlessly through corridors. Others distorted light so completely that prisoners could no longer distinguish day from night. Certain rooms triggered hallucinations powerful enough to leave experienced auras trembling after only minutes inside. The deeper the ministry officials explored, the more disturbing the fortress became. There were no comfortable living quarters anywhere within the structure. No signs of ordinary domestic life. no libraries filled with research, no dining halls. The fortress existed almost entirely as an instrument of suffering. Even Acrisdis's private chambers were sparse and cold, containing only a narrow bed, blackened candles, and strange magical devices whose purposes were never fully understood. It was as though the wizard had stripped away every ordinary human need from his life until nothing remained except obsession. Historians later debated whether Acrisdis had originally discovered the Dementors near the island or somehow drawn them there intentionally. Some ancient magical texts suggested that Dementors naturally gathered wherever despair reached sufficient intensity. Others hinted at darker possibilities, theories that certain forbidden rituals could attract them like predators sensing blood in water. Whatever the truth, by the time the ministry arrived, the creatures had fully claimed the fortress as their territory. They nested within the highest towers and deepest chambers alike, gliding through walls with slow, unnatural movements. The temperature dropped sharply wherever they gathered. Torches dimmed in their presence. Strong emotions became difficult to maintain. Even hardened ministry officials found themselves struggling to remember why they had volunteered for the expedition at all. One report described a senior aura standing motionless for nearly an hour in the middle of a corridor, while a Dementor hovered nearby. When another wizard finally pulled him away, beneath the protection of a Patronus, the man reportedly wept without understanding why. The ministry quickly realized that the fortress represented a danger unlike any they had previously encountered. Yet it also presented a difficult problem. Destroying the island entirely might release the Dementors into the wider world. No one understood the creatures well enough to predict how they would behave without the fortress containing them. Some officials argued that the entire island should be sealed permanently and abandoned. Others feared that future dark wizards might rediscover the location if it remained unguarded. For several years, Azkaban remained largely untouched while the ministry debated what to do. During that period, a small number of researchers and magical officials continued studying the fortress from a distance. None stayed longer than necessary. The emotional toll of prolonged exposure to the island proved severe, even for trained personnel. Visitors returned pale and exhausted, speaking quietly and sleeping poorly for weeks afterward. A few refused ever to discuss what they experienced there at all. Yet alongside the horror, some ministry officials began noticing something else. The fortress was nearly impossible to escape. The surrounding sea alone made flight dangerous during much of the year. Apparition remained unstable due to lingering magical distortions left behind by Acrisdis. The cliffs surrounding the island were sheer and jagged, and the Dementors themselves formed a living perimeter more terrifying than any ordinary guards. At the same time, Wizarding Britain faced a growing problem with magical crime. The ministry's existing holding facilities were temporary and unreliable. Dangerous dark wizards often escaped before trial or overpowered ordinary magical guards. Smaller prisons scattered across Britain lacked the protections necessary to contain highly skilled prisoners. Each major dark wizard forced the ministry into expensive improvised solutions. Some officials quietly began suggesting that perhaps the terrible island already possessed everything needed for permanent containment. The proposal horrified others immediately. There were fierce arguments inside the ministry chambers. Some viewed the fortress as irredeemably cursed. Others argued that using Dementors as prison guards crossed a moral boundary wizarding society should never approach. A few believed that even entering the fortress repeatedly risked exposing ministry officials to unknown magical corruption lingering from Acrisdis's experiments. But fear has always been persuasive in politics. Every new magical crime strengthened support for a permanent high-security prison. And Azkaban offered something deeply attractive to frightened officials. It required very little effort to maintain. The Dementors needed no salary, no sleep, no loyalty beyond access to suffering itself. Prisoners guarded by them rarely even attempted escape. The emotional paralysis caused by prolonged exposure destroyed resistance long before physical strength mattered. Gradually, practical concerns began overpowering ethical ones. The ministry started modifying sections of the fortress for formal imprisonment. Certain chambers were reinforced with additional magical protections. Basic administrative offices were added near the upper levels, where Dementor activity remained weaker. Cells were reorganized into structured blocks rather than the chaotic arrangement left behind by Acrisdis. Yet no amount of renovation could truly transform the island. Workers assigned to Azkaban stayed only temporarily whenever possible. Many experienced vivid nightmares after prolonged shifts inside the fortress. Some reported hearing whispers in empty corridors or glimpsing figures standing motionless at the edges of torchlight. A few abandoned the work entirely after emotional breakdowns that ministry healers struggled to explain. Even the sea surrounding the island seemed permanently altered by what had occurred there. Approaching ships often encountered sudden, unnatural fog banks, regardless of weather conditions elsewhere. Waves crashed constantly against the black cliffs below the fortress, creating an endless rhythm that echoed faintly through the stone halls. Seabirds rarely flew near the island. The few that did often circled briefly before turning away abruptly as though sensing danger. And always, drifting through corridors and towers alike, came the Dementors. The ministry attempted to formalize arrangements with the creatures, though agreement may have been too generous a word. Dementors did not think like humans. They did not obey laws or ideology. They responded only to hunger. The ministry essentially offered them an endless supply of despair in exchange for containment services. It was an arrangement built entirely upon mutual convenience. At first, many officials believed they could maintain careful control over the creatures through regulation and magical oversight. Detailed procedures were created governing prisoner transport, guard patrols, and restricted areas within the prison. Patronus training became mandatory for certain personnel assigned to Azkaban duty. Yet beneath those systems lingered an uncomfortable truth. The ministry did not truly command the Dementors at all. The creatures allowed the arrangement because it benefited them, nothing more. This reality became increasingly obvious during the prison's early years. Guards stationed too long within Azkaban often developed emotional numbness and depression. Prisoners deteriorated far faster than expected. Some lost the ability to speak coherently after only months inside the fortress. Others became physically weak despite receiving adequate food and shelter. The prison punished not through physical pain alone, but through the gradual destruction of hope itself. And slowly, almost without realizing it, Wizarding Britain accepted this as normal. Parents frightened children with warnings about Azkaban. Newspapers described it as the natural fate awaiting dark wizards. Ministry officials pointed toward the island whenever new threats emerged, reassuring the public that dangerous criminals would disappear behind those distant black walls forever. But the fortress retained its older nature beneath the ministry's control, because Azkaban had not truly been built for justice. It had been built by a man who studied suffering like an art form. A fortress shaped by isolation, despair, and fear could never entirely become something else, merely because officials hung ministry banners over its doors. The stone remembered what it had once been. And far out in the freezing northern sea, beneath endless drifting fog, the prison waited patiently for the long centuries of grief still to come. In the years after the Ministry first claimed the northern fortress, Azkaban existed in an uncertain state between horror and necessity. Officially, it remained little more than an isolated holding facility reserved for the most dangerous magical criminals. Unofficially, many within the Ministry still feared the island deeply enough that they avoided speaking of it whenever possible. Few witches or wizards volunteered for assignments there twice. Fewer still returned unchanged. And yet, the prison endured. Part of that endurance came from the changing nature of wizarding Britain itself. As the centuries passed, magical governments became larger, more bureaucratic, and increasingly concerned with order. New laws emerged regulating everything from magical creature control to wand ownership and dangerous enchantments. With those laws came trials, punishments, and a growing desire to demonstrate authority over dark magic before it spread beyond control. Fear shaped much of this development. The wizarding world liked to imagine itself wiser than the non-magical one surrounding it, but magical history was filled with the same cycles of panic and violence that haunted ordinary human societies. Dark wizards rose and fell with alarming regularity. Some sought immortality. Others pursued forbidden magic or attempted domination through terror. Small communities were destroyed by rogue curses. Families vanished during magical feuds. Entire regions occasionally fell under the influence of dangerous magical cults before Ministry forces restored order. Each crisis left behind frightened officials demanding stronger protections. Before Azkaban became fully operational, magical imprisonment was fragmented and inconsistent. Smaller holding facilities existed throughout Britain, but most were temporary. Dangerous prisoners often escaped through apparition, wandless magic, or outside assistance. Wealthy pure-blood families occasionally manipulated legal outcomes entirely, ensuring relatives avoided severe punishment regardless of guilt. Other prisoners simply disappeared during transport between locations. The Ministry wanted something permanent. More importantly, they wanted something feared. Ordinary prisons confined bodies. Azkaban broke spirits. That distinction mattered enormously to the officials advocating for its expansion. Some Ministry leaders quietly argued that fear itself could become a form of social control. If dark wizards believed Azkaban represented a fate worse than death, perhaps future violence could be prevented before it began. Newspapers gradually reinforced this image, describing the prison in increasingly grim language, until the very name Azkaban became synonymous with hopelessness throughout wizarding Britain. Parents frightened children with stories about the island. Young Aurors spoke of it nervously during training. Even hardened Ministry officials lowered their voices when discussing prisoner transfers across the North Sea. The prison's reputation became part of its power. At the center of this terrifying system stood the Dementors themselves. No magical creatures in recorded history inspired quite the same universal dread. Dragons were dangerous, certainly, but their violence was physical and predictable. Acromantulas hunted from hunger. Werewolves transformed according to lunar cycles. Dementors were something colder and stranger. They consumed emotion itself. Most witches and wizards could barely endure standing near them for long periods. The creatures radiated despair so intensely that ordinary happiness became impossible in their presence. Memories curdled into grief. Hope faded. Warmth vanished from both body and mind. The Ministry nevertheless convinced itself these creatures could be controlled. In truth, the arrangement between the Ministry and the Dementors resembled less a partnership than a mutual dependency neither side fully understood. The Dementors remained concentrated upon the island because Azkaban provided endless emotional sustenance. The ministry benefited because prisoners guarded by Dementors rarely resisted, escaped, or retained enough strength to threaten society afterward. The cost of that arrangement was paid quietly by everyone forced to enter the prison. Early prison guards experienced severe emotional deterioration after extended assignments. Some developed chronic depression so profound they resigned from magical service entirely. Others became detached from ordinary life, unable to enjoy food, conversation, or family companionship after spending months within Azkaban's walls. A few suffered complete psychological collapse. The ministry responded not by questioning the prison itself, but by rotating personnel more frequently. It was easier to manage symptoms than confront the larger moral problem. Prisoners fared far worse. The first years of Azkaban's operation established patterns that would remain unchanged for centuries. Newly arrived inmates often entered the prison defiant or furious. Some shouted threats at guards while being escorted through the fortress corridors. Others proclaimed innocence endlessly, convinced their cases would soon be overturned. But Azkaban had a way of reducing every human emotion, eventually into the same exhausted silence. The Dementors fed constantly. Prisoners reported losing track of time within days. Sunlight rarely reached the cells. The sea outside created an endless distant roar beneath the fortress walls, while cold, damp air crept endlessly through stone corridors. Meals arrived mechanically. Guards spoke little. Conversations between prisoners faded quickly, because even speech required emotional energy, difficult to maintain under Dementor exposure. Worst of all were the memories. Dementors did not merely cause sadness. They forced victims to relive their worst experiences repeatedly until those moments overwhelmed everything else. Regret became stronger than identity itself. Prisoners described forgetting the faces of loved ones while remaining unable to forget moments of shame, grief, humiliation, or terror. Some prisoners eventually stopped speaking altogether. Others screamed through entire nights until their voices failed. Azkaban transformed punishment into something deeply psychological. The prison did not rely primarily upon chains, torture devices, or physical violence. Instead, it weaponized despair itself. That fact disturbed some ministry officials even during the prison's earliest decades. A small number argued repeatedly that the use of Dementors crossed ethical boundaries wizarding society should not accept. But those arguments rarely survived public fear. Whenever debates arose regarding prison reform, supporters of Azkaban pointed toward the dangers outside its walls. Every escaped dark wizard strengthened their case. Every magical attack reminded frightened citizens why harsh containment felt necessary. Politicians learned quickly that promising security through stronger punishment was far easier than advocating mercy toward dangerous criminals. And so, the prison expanded. Additional cell blocks were constructed within the fortress over time. Though constructed was perhaps misleading. Much of Azkaban seemed to reshape itself gradually around new magical additions, old corridors merging with newer architecture until the entire prison felt timeless and disorienting. Guards unfamiliar with certain sections occasionally became lost despite detailed maps. The island resisted ordinary logic. Some prisoners later claimed they heard movement inside walls where no passageways existed. Others described doors appearing in corridors, only to vanish days later. Whether these experiences resulted from Dementor exposure, lingering magical distortions left by Acrisdis, or simple psychological deterioration remained impossible to determine. Yet even among the horror, routines developed. Prisoner transports became highly organized operations conducted under heavy magical security. Convicted witches and wizards were escorted from ministry courtrooms, in chains enchanted to suppress wandless magic. Most prisoners traveled silently by the time they reached the sea. Some had already encountered dementors during trial proceedings and understood enough about Azkaban to feel terror long before seeing the island itself. The approach by boat became infamous within Wizarding Britain. Former prisoners who survived release later described the experience with remarkable similarity, despite differences in age, crime, and background. The fortress emerged slowly from northern fog, like something ancient and unnatural, rising directly from the sea. Its black towers seemed less built than grown from the cliffs beneath them. Windows reflected no warmth. No birds circled overhead. Even the waves surrounding the island sounded wrong somehow, too heavy against the rocks below. And always, waiting near the docks, came the Dementors. Most prisoners broke emotionally before entering the fortress itself. Guards learned not to look too closely at new arrivals during that final approach. Some wept openly. Others whispered desperately to themselves, as if trying to hold on to memories before they vanished. A few became completely numb, staring blankly toward the island, with expressions already hollowed by fear. The ministry publicly described Azkaban as justice. Privately, many officials understood it functioned more as terror, yet terror proved politically useful. As generations passed, Azkaban became deeply woven into the identity of wizarding law enforcement. Auras measured success partly through how many dangerous criminals they delivered there. Ministry propaganda emphasized the prison's impossibility of escape. Newspapers treated transfers to Azkaban almost like funerals, because in many ways they were. Families rarely expected prisoners to return emotionally intact, even if they survived imprisonment physically. Entire sections of magical society adapted themselves around this reality. Children learned Patronus theory, partly because Dementors existed. Certain healing practices evolved specifically to treat emotional damage caused by exposure to the creatures. Wizengamot trials became increasingly dramatic because sentencing someone to Azkaban carried enormous symbolic weight. And throughout it all, the Dementors remained patient. They drifted through corridors and towers alike without loyalty or ideology, feeding endlessly upon the misery surrounding them. The ministry continued insisting the creatures served under governmental authority, but the truth remained disturbingly fragile. The prison functioned only because the Dementors found Azkaban useful. Nothing guaranteed that arrangement would last forever. Some older ministry officials quietly worried about this dependency. They understood that Wizarding Britain had built its entire prison system upon creatures no one truly controlled. But by then, Azkaban had existed too long to dismantle easily. Entire generations had grown accustomed to its presence. Alternatives seemed expensive, uncertain, and politically dangerous. So the fortress remained where it had always stood, alone in the freezing northern sea. A place born from cruelty, maintained through fear, and slowly becoming something even larger than the dark wizard who first created it. Among all the creatures known to the wizarding world, none inspired the same quiet horror as the Dementors of Azkaban. Dragons could be fought, giants could be reasoned with or avoided. Even dark wizards remained human beneath their cruelty. Dementors were something far colder. They did not rage or threaten or shout. They simply arrived, and with them came the slow drowning of every good thing inside the human mind. Most witches and wizards spent their entire lives hoping never to encounter one. The creatures themselves seemed almost less like living beings and more like absences carved into the shape of cloaked figures. Witnesses struggled to describe them clearly afterward. Their bodies remained hidden beneath rotting black robes that drifted unnaturally, even in still air. Hands resembling grey, decaying flesh emerged occasionally from within their sleeves, thin and skeletal like drowned corpses pulled from freezing water. Beneath their hoods, there was only darkness and the faint sound of rattling breath. Yet the true terror of Dementors was never their appearance. It was what happened to the world around them. Warmth vanished first. Not ordinary cold, but a deep, unnatural freezing that seemed to spread directly into bone and memory alike. Light dimmed. Sounds became distant and muffled. Then came the emotions. Happiness faded quietly at first, like mist dissolving beneath rain, until even the memory of joy felt unreachable. People exposed to Dementors often described the sensation as being abandoned by life itself. Inside Azkaban, that feeling never ended. The prison functioned according to routines so bleak and repetitive that prisoners eventually lost all sense of time. Dawn and night mattered little within the fortress. Sunlight rarely entered the cells, and thick clouds covered the island through much of the year regardless. Prisoners woke in darkness, sat in darkness, and slept in darkness, broken only by the distant crash of waves below the cliffs and the soft, gliding movements of Dementors drifting through corridors. Food arrived without conversation. Guards rarely lingered near cells longer than necessary. Human interaction itself became dangerous because strong emotional attachments only created more pain for Dementors to feed upon later. Many prisoners stopped speaking after only weeks. The cells themselves were brutally simple. Rough stone walls sweated constantly with moisture from the surrounding sea air. Narrow windows high above the floors allowed only slivers of grey northern light to enter. Thin blankets did little against the endless cold that clung to every surface. Water dripped steadily through pipes and cracks in the walls, creating a constant rhythm that prisoners learned to hate because it reminded them how slowly time moved inside the fortress. But physical discomfort was never Azkaban's greatest weapon. The true punishment came from memory. Dementors fed upon positive human emotion: hope, love, comfort, happiness, pride, warmth. In their presence, those things weakened rapidly until only the worst memories remained strong enough to survive. Prisoners became trapped within their own suffering, forced endlessly back toward moments of grief, shame, terror, and loss. A witch who had once laughed easily might suddenly remember only the death of a parent. A wizard who once loved Quidditch or music or family dinners would find those memories fading, while humiliation and heartbreak remained vivid beyond endurance. The creatures stripped people down slowly until pain became the only emotion left. Some prisoners relived the same traumatic memory so often they could no longer separate past from present. Others forgot entire portions of their lives completely. Names vanished, faces blurred, childhood memories dissolved into emptiness. Yet the worst moments always remained. This was why Azkaban broke people so thoroughly. Ordinary prisons punished the body while leaving the mind intact. Azkaban attacked identity itself. Healers studying former prisoners later observed that long-term exposure to Dementors created symptoms resembling profound magical trauma. Survivors often struggled to experience ordinary happiness even years after release. Food tasted dull. Music felt meaningless. Human companionship became exhausting rather than comforting. Some woke screaming from nightmares for decades. Others simply never recovered at all. The Ministry rarely discussed these consequences publicly. Officially, Azkaban existed to protect society from dangerous criminals. Admitting the full psychological destruction caused by Dementor exposure would have forced uncomfortable questions about whether the prison represented justice or something much darker. Still, whispers spread through Wizarding Britain over the centuries. Former prisoners occasionally returned home after serving sentences only to sit silently for hours staring at empty fireplaces. Families described loved ones who seemed emotionally hollowed out, moving through life like exhausted ghosts. Some could no longer cast Patronuses because they lacked enough happy memories to sustain the charm. Even guards stationed at Azkaban temporarily were affected. Most Ministry employees assigned to the prison learned defensive Patronus magic before arriving on the island. The Silver Animal Guardians provided temporary protection against the creature's emotional influence. Yet maintaining a Patronus required concentration upon powerful positive memories, and Azkaban made such emotions increasingly difficult to access over time. Some guards developed elaborate routines to preserve their sanity. They carried photographs of family members hidden beneath robes. Others memorized favorite songs or childhood memories, repeating them silently while walking patrol routes through the fortress. A few reportedly resigned after discovering they could no longer remember the faces of their children clearly enough to summon Patronuses at full strength. The prison consumed everyone slowly, and still the Dementors fed. Prisoners often heard them before seeing them. The air changed first, a spreading cold deeper than winter itself. Then came silence. Conversations stopped. Thoughts slowed. Finally, somewhere beyond the cell door, the soft rattling inhalation of a creature drawing near. Those moments became unbearable even for hardened criminals. Some prisoners curled into corners, shaking uncontrollably whenever Dementors passed through corridors. Others begged or screamed, despite knowing the creatures could not be reasoned with. A few attempted self-harm simply to escape the emotional torture of prolonged exposure. But Azkaban offered remarkably few forms of escape. The island itself remained nearly impossible to flee. Apparition did not function properly within the fortress due to ancient magical distortions and Ministry protections layered together over centuries. The surrounding sea was freezing and violent, filled with jagged rocks and dangerous currents. Brooms were confiscated immediately upon arrival, and beyond all physical barriers waited the Dementors themselves, capable of sensing human emotion across surprising distances. Most prisoners eventually stopped imagining escape entirely. That surrender was part of the prison's design. The emotional atmosphere inside Azkaban differed profoundly from ordinary fear. Fear still contains movement, possibility, the instinct to survive or resist. Azkaban slowly removed even that. Prisoners entered terrified, but eventually became exhausted by despair itself. The mind can sustain panic only so long before collapse begins. Silence became the dominant sound of the prison. Not complete silence, of course. There were always waves crashing below the cliffs, water dripping somewhere deep within the fortress walls, footsteps echoing faintly through distant corridors. Sometimes prisoners cried out in nightmares, or muttered to themselves in neighboring cells. But compared to ordinary human environments, Azkaban felt overwhelmingly empty. No laughter, no conversation, no music, no warmth. Only the slow, endless erosion of hope. This atmosphere affected even visitors arriving briefly upon official business. Ministry officials conducting inspections often shortened trips whenever possible. Auras escorting prisoners preferred leaving the island immediately after transfers, rather than remaining overnight. Even experienced magical law enforcement officers sometimes became physically ill after extended time within the fortress. One senior Ministry employee reportedly described Azkaban as a place where happiness itself feels fictional. the Dementors seemed strongest during storms. On certain nights, northern tempests battered the fortress so violently that waves crashed against the cliffs with thunderous force, while freezing rain lashed the towers. During such weather, the creatures drifted through the prison in enormous numbers, their dark robes blending almost seamlessly with the surrounding darkness. Prisoners later described those nights as the worst experiences of their lives. Memories became sharper, grief deepened. Some claimed they could actually feel the creatures feeding upon their emotions like invisible parasites. It was during these storms that prisoners most often lost themselves completely. The ministry kept records of inmates driven permanently insane by Azkaban, though exact numbers remained hidden from public view. Some prisoners forgot language entirely after prolonged imprisonment. Others retreated so deeply into hallucination and trauma that they no longer recognized human beings standing before them. A few simply stopped moving or responding until death followed quietly afterward. And still, despite everything, the prison remained politically popular. Fear made the wizarding public willing to tolerate horrors they might otherwise reject. Dangerous dark wizards existed. Violent magical crimes occurred. The idea of such people trapped forever upon a distant island felt comforting to ordinary citizens living safe lives far from Azkaban's walls. Most never thought too carefully about what happened inside the fortress itself, but there were occasional moments when the wider wizarding world glimpsed the truth. Families visiting imprisoned relatives sometimes returned pale and trembling after witnessing conditions inside the prison. Former inmates released after serving shorter sentences appeared decades older than before imprisonment. Rumors spread quietly among healers regarding the permanent emotional damage caused by Dementor exposure. Yet Azkaban endured because it functioned exactly as intended. Prisoners feared it more than death. And far out in the freezing northern sea, beneath endless drifting fog and towering black stone, the Dementors continued gliding silently through the corridors, feeding patiently upon every scrap of human happiness they could find. As the centuries passed, Azkaban slowly transformed from a hidden northern fortress into something woven deeply into the fabric of wizarding Britain. Children grew up hearing its name whispered by anxious parents. Newspapers described criminals vanishing behind its black walls, as though the prison existed beyond ordinary life entirely. Trials before the Wizengamot often ended not with simple imprisonment, but with a sentence to Azkaban, spoken in tones that resembled funeral rites more than legal judgment. And somewhere far beyond the mainland, beneath endless grey skies, the fortress continued waiting. The first generations of prisoners sent there came from many different corners of magical society. Some were dark wizards responsible for curses and murders. Others were political extremists, smugglers, or practitioners of forbidden magical experiments. A few were likely innocent, victims of corrupted investigations or ministry panic during unstable periods of wizarding history. Inside Azkaban, those distinctions mattered very little. The Dementors fed upon everyone equally, yet the prisoners themselves remained profoundly different from one another, and over time, the guards stationed at Azkaban noticed certain patterns. Some inmates collapsed emotionally almost immediately. Others resisted for months or even years before despair finally consumed them. A rare few maintained fragments of identity despite prolonged exposure to the creatures. Those differences fascinated certain ministry healers studying the prison from afar. It seemed that guilt affected imprisonment in complicated ways. Prisoners tormented by regret often deteriorated rapidly because the Dementors could feed endlessly upon memories of wrongdoing and shame. Others who believed themselves unjustly imprisoned sometimes retained stronger emotional resistance, clinging to anger or certainty even as happier memories faded. But no one emerged untouched. Among the earliest famous prisoners were dark wizards whose names drifted through magical history like shadows half remembered. Some had once held respected positions within wizarding society before turning toward increasingly dangerous magic. Others emerged from isolated pure-blood families, obsessed with ancient magical supremacy. Their crimes varied enormously, but the prison reduced them all eventually into the same hollow-eyed figures pacing freezing cells, while waves crashed endlessly beyond the walls. One infamous prisoner during the 18th century reportedly spent years screaming his innocence so constantly that guards could hear him through multiple corridors at once. Eventually, the screams weakened into muttering. Then silence. When ministry officials reviewed his case decades later, they discovered evidence suggesting he may indeed have been innocent all along. By then, it no longer mattered. Azkaban had already taken everything from him. The prison developed its own strange social order over time, despite the isolation imposed by the Dementors. Prisoners housed near one another sometimes communicated through walls, using tapping patterns or whispered conversations during moments when guards passed elsewhere. Friendships formed rarely but intensely, forged from the desperate human need for connection within overwhelming despair. Other prisoners became dangerous even without wands. The emotional pressure of Azkaban amplified paranoia, resentment, and hatred until certain inmates seemed almost transformed by the prison itself. Guards occasionally reported prisoners staring silently for hours with expressions so empty they no longer appeared entirely sane. Others muttered continuously to unseen figures, reliving arguments or conversations from decades earlier. The worst cells remained deep within the lower fortress levels, where Acrisdis's original chambers still lingered beneath ministry renovations. Prisoners assigned there rarely lasted long emotionally. Some guards believed the stone itself retained traces of ancient suffering, strong enough to intensify Dementor effects. Whether true or not, those sections developed terrifying reputations throughout the prison. Even experienced guards avoided lingering there unnecessarily. Outside Azkaban, wizarding society continued changing, while the prison endured almost untouched by time. New ministers came and went. Magical laws evolved. Entire generations rose and disappeared. Yet the fortress remained standing against the northern sea exactly as it always had, cold and isolated, and endlessly feeding upon human misery. The public viewed this permanence as reassuring. Azkaban symbolized certainty in an uncertain world. No matter how dangerous a dark wizard became, the ministry could promise eventual imprisonment behind those impossible walls. The prison represented control over chaos, or at least the appearance of such control. Newspapers reinforced this image carefully. When dangerous criminals were captured, reporters described prisoner transports to Azkaban with dramatic detail. Readers learned about chains enchanted against wandless magic, heavily guarded boats crossing freezing waters, and Dementors waiting silently upon the docks. Public fascination with the prison grew steadily, despite widespread fear of it. People feared Azkaban, but they also needed it to exist. This dependence became especially visible whenever prisoners escaped smaller ministry facilities elsewhere. Each escape reignited public anxiety and strengthened support for harsher sentencing. Politicians promising stricter security gained popularity quickly. Calls for prison reform faded whenever frightened citizens imagined dangerous wizards roaming free. And so, Azkaban expanded further. By the 19th century, The prison held inmates from nearly every part of magical Britain. Some remained there only briefly before release or transfer. Others vanished behind its walls for life. Entire family lines occasionally became associated with the prison through repeated arrests tied to dark magic or blood supremacist violence. Among the most feared of these pure-blood families were the Lestranges. Long before Bellatrix Lestrange would become infamous during Voldemort's rise, the Lestrange name already carried associations with cruelty, elitism, and dangerous magical ideology. Various members of the family appeared repeatedly throughout ministry records, connected to dark curses, illegal rituals, and political extremism. Though not every Lestrange entered Azkaban, enough did that the family became deeply intertwined with the prison's history. The same was true of several other old wizarding families, obsessed with blood purity and ancient magical power. For some prisoners from such backgrounds, Azkaban produced a particularly devastating collapse. Raised to believe themselves superior to ordinary witches and wizards, they entered the prison carrying enormous pride and entitlement. Dementors stripped those identities away mercilessly. Wealth, family influence, education, ancestry. None of it mattered inside the fortress. Only despair remained equal. Yet certain prisoners reacted differently. A few dark wizards maintained themselves emotionally through obsession strong enough to survive even Dementor exposure. Hatred, fanaticism, and violent ideology sometimes created strange forms of psychological resistance. Prisoners consumed entirely by revenge or loyalty to dark causes occasionally retained more sanity than expected, because the Dementors found fewer warm memories to feed upon in the first place. This disturbed ministry observers deeply. It suggested Azkaban did not merely punish evil. Under certain circumstances, it could preserve or even sharpen it. The prison also revealed uncomfortable truths about wizarding justice itself. Trials during politically unstable periods often became rushed or heavily influenced by public fear. Suspected dark wizards were sometimes sentenced based upon association rather than direct evidence. The Wizengamot liked to imagine itself wise and fair, but fear has always distorted legal systems, both magical and non-magical alike. And Azkaban stood ready to receive whoever society feared most at any given moment. Some prisoners entered the fortress weeping and broken already. Others arrived furious, proclaiming innocence or threatening revenge. A few walked into the prison in eerie silence, understanding immediately that resistance would accomplish nothing there. The guards remembered those prisoners longest, not because they survived more easily, but because they seemed to comprehend Azkaban's true nature faster than others. The prison was not merely confinement, it was erosion, a slow wearing away of memory, hope, personality, and desire until only emptiness remained. One elderly guard later described watching new inmates during their first week as observing candles extinguish one by one. Most prisoners changed visibly within months. Skin paled from lack of sunlight. Eyes became hollow and distant. Movements slowed as emotional exhaustion deepened. Some developed habits that persisted endlessly inside the prison, pacing cell floors in measured patterns, whispering names repeatedly beneath their breath, staring through narrow windows toward the sea as though trying to remember why freedom once mattered. And beyond every corridor drifted the Dementors. The creatures became so integrated into Azkaban's operation that younger generations of witches and wizards could scarcely imagine the prison functioning without them. Few paused to consider how dangerous that dependence truly was. The ministry insisted the creatures remained under control, and most citizens accepted this because the alternative felt too frightening to contemplate. But there were always warning signs. Dementors occasionally grew restless during periods of heightened magical conflict across Britain. Guards reported the creatures becoming more aggressive whenever large numbers of emotionally unstable prisoners arrived together. Certain ministry officials privately worried that the prison no longer merely housed the Dementors, but actively strengthened them. After all, Azkaban provided an endless concentration of fear, grief, hatred, guilt, and hopelessness, unlike anywhere else in the wizarding world. The creatures were feeding constantly. And far out in the freezing northern sea, beneath drifting fog and endless grey skies, the prison continued swallowing generations of witches and wizards, while the wider magical world comforted itself with the belief that the darkness remained safely locked behind stone walls forever. For most of its history, Azkaban existed at the distant edge of wizarding consciousness, feared deeply but rarely discussed in detail. Criminals disappeared there. Dark wizards vanished behind its walls. Families spoke its name carefully and then moved on to safer subjects. But during the 1970s, as Lord Voldemort rose slowly to power across Britain, the prison changed. The fortress that had once housed isolated criminals and scattered dark witches became something far larger and far more crowded. The First Wizarding War filled Azkaban faster than ever before. Fear spread through magical Britain in ways unseen for generations. People disappeared overnight. Entire families were found dead beneath signs of dark curses. Ministry officials began speaking in whispers, even inside supposedly protected offices. No one knew who could be trusted. Friends betrayed friends. Neighbors reported suspicious magical activity out of panic. Owls carrying anonymous accusations arrived constantly at the ministry. And somewhere beyond the mainland, the Black Fortress waited beneath endless northern fog. The Ministry of Magic responded to Voldemort's rise with increasing desperation. Auras were granted broader authority. Surveillance expanded. Trials became shorter and harsher. Barty Crouch Sr., head of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement, emerged as one of the strongest voices demanding absolute measures against dark magic. Brilliant, disciplined, and utterly convinced that order must survive at any cost, he transformed the ministry's response into something approaching wartime government. Under his leadership, Azkaban became central to that strategy. The prison population surged rapidly as suspected Death Eaters, dark sympathizers, smugglers, and accused collaborators were sent north across the sea. Some prisoners were undoubtedly guilty of terrible crimes. Others likely fell victim to panic, misinformation, or political pressure during increasingly chaotic investigations. The line between justice and fear began to blur. Prison transports became constant. Ministry boats crossed freezing waters, carrying chained prisoners beneath heavy guard, while Dementors gathered silently along the docks, awaiting new arrivals. Azkaban's corridors, once eerily quiet between scattered inmates, filled steadily with exhausted voices, distant shouting, and the soft, rattling breaths of creatures feeding upon growing despair. The prison itself seemed to grow darker during those years. Guards stationed there reported unusual increases in Dementor activity. Entire sections of the fortress became almost unbearably cold, even during summer months. Patronus charms weakened more quickly inside the prison than before, forcing guards to rotate shifts constantly to avoid emotional collapse. But the ministry ignored such warnings. Outside Azkaban, Wizarding Britain was descending toward terror. Voldemort's forces operated through secrecy and fear, striking unpredictably before vanishing again into hidden networks of followers and sympathizers. Every arrest felt important. Every captured Death Eater became proof that the ministry still maintained some measure of control, and so the prison kept filling. Many of the prisoners arriving during the First Wizarding War were not ordinary criminals. They were ideologues, fanatics, witches, and wizards who believed utterly in Voldemort's vision of magical supremacy. Some entered Azkaban proud rather than frightened, convinced the Dark Lord would eventually rise victorious and free them. The Dementors tested that confidence slowly. Some Death Eaters broke quickly beneath prolonged exposure to despair. Others retreated into numb silence. But a few displayed something deeply unsettling. Their hatred remained stronger than their fear. The guards noticed it first among the Lestranges. Bellatrix Lestrange and her husband Rodolphus came from one of the oldest pure-blood families in Britain. Wealthy, aristocratic, and fiercely loyal to Voldemort's ideology. Bellatrix especially possessed an intensity that disturbed even experienced ministry officials. Her devotion to the Dark Lord bordered upon religious fanaticism. During the war, she had participated willingly in torture, murder, and acts of magical cruelty that horrified even hardened Aurors. Yet inside Azkaban, her madness became something stranger. Most prisoners weakened beneath Dementor exposure because the creatures consumed every source of warmth and hope within them. Bellatrix, however, seemed sustained by obsession itself. Hatred gave her structure. Devotion gave her purpose. Guards reported hearing her muttering Voldemort's name repeatedly inside her cell, like prayer or incantation. Even after years of imprisonment, she retained flashes of terrifying emotional intensity that many other prisoners lost entirely. This frightened the prison staff more than broken prisoners ever had, because Azkaban was meant to destroy dangerous people emotionally. Bellatrix seemed only to sharpen beneath the suffering. Other Death Eaters varied enormously in their responses. Some denied Voldemort publicly and begged for release. Others collapsed into despair, once separated from the violent movement that had once given their lives meaning. Entire prison blocks became filled with hollow-eyed former followers who no longer resembled the fanatics that had once terrorized Wizarding Britain. The Dementors fed well during those years. The prison overflowed not merely with guilt and grief, but with fear on every level of society. Guards feared prisoners. Prisoners feared the Dementors. The Ministry feared Voldemort. And ordinary witches and wizards feared all of it together. That fear reshaped Wizarding law enforcement itself. Barty Crouch Sr. authorized increasingly severe measures against suspected Death Eaters. Aurors gained permission to use previously forbidden spells during combat situations. Detentions sometimes occurred before complete investigations finished. Public pressure demanded swift punishment, and Azkaban stood ready to receive the accused. Some ministry officials worried privately that the government itself was changing under the pressure of war, but questioning harsh policies during Voldemort's rise often appeared dangerously naive. Entire families were dying. Dark marks burned above homes across Britain. The public wanted security more than philosophical debate, and Azkaban symbolized security, at least outwardly. Behind the prison walls, however, conditions deteriorated steadily under the growing inmate population. Dementors drifted through overcrowded corridors, feeding continuously upon concentrated despair, unlike anything the fortress had experienced previously. Guards spent less time near prisoners whenever possible, because emotional exposure became increasingly overwhelming. Human interaction inside the prison diminished even further. Many prisoners simply disappeared into silence. Others screamed endlessly through nights, while storms battered the fortress towers. New inmates often arrived defiant, proclaiming loyalty to Voldemort or promising revenge upon the Ministry. Months later, those same prisoners sat motionless in freezing cells, unable even to speak clearly. Azkaban consumed individuality methodically, yet not everyone sent there during the war truly belonged among Voldemort's followers. This became one of the darkest truths hidden beneath Ministry propaganda during those years. Panic and desperation led to wrongful imprisonments that later generations would barely discuss openly. Some accused witches and wizards lacked sufficient evidence against them, but were imprisoned anyway, because authorities feared appearing weak. Others became casualties of mistaken identity, false testimony, or political pressure. Once inside Azkaban, proving innocence became almost impossible. The prison itself erased people too effectively. Families of prisoners often suffered alongside them. Wives, husbands, parents, and children waited desperately for news, while the Ministry revealed little about conditions inside the fortress. Visiting rights remained severely restricted due to security concerns and Dementor danger. Some relatives never saw imprisoned loved ones again, except during funerals held years later after quiet notices arrived from the Ministry. Azkaban spread suffering far beyond its walls, and still the war worsened. As Voldemort's influence expanded through the late 1970s, the prison became almost mythic within public imagination. Newspaper headlines described dangerous Death Eaters vanishing forever into the northern fortress. Aurors returning from successful operations were praised as heroes for sending dark wizards to Azkaban. The prison represented punishment severe enough to reassure a terrified population. But beneath that reassurance lurked something deeply uncomfortable. Wizarding Britain had begun depending emotionally upon despair itself. The Dementors were no longer merely prison guards. They had become part of the Ministry's entire strategies of social control. Fear of Azkaban discouraged dissent, intimidated criminals, and comforted frightened citizens who believed terrible people were being contained somewhere far away beyond the sea. Few paused to ask what relying upon such creatures might eventually cost them. Inside the prison, the answer was already becoming visible. Guards grew colder, emotionally, over time. Some developed permanent depression after long service. Prisoners emerged shattered when occasionally released, and the Dementors themselves multiplied steadily within the fortress, feeding upon unprecedented levels of human misery generated by the war. It was as though Azkaban had finally discovered its true purpose. The island, built originally by Acrizdis for experiments in terror, now stood at the center of Wizarding Britain's greatest conflict in generations. Its corridors filled with dark wizards, broken prisoners, grieving guards, and drifting creatures that fed endlessly upon despair. And far beyond the mainland, beneath cold skies and crashing northern waves, the prison continued waiting for still more prisoners to arrive. Among all the prisoners who entered Azkaban during the First Wizarding War, few left deeper impressions upon the fortress than Bellatrix Lestrange. Even before her imprisonment, her name carried a kind of cold fascination throughout Wizarding Britain. She came from the ancient House of Black, one of the oldest and proudest pureblood families in magical society, raised among traditions obsessed with blood status, magical superiority, and the preservation of old wizarding power. From childhood, Bellatrix had been taught that certain people mattered more than others. By the time she entered adulthood, that belief had hardened into something fanatical. Unlike many followers who joined Voldemort gradually out of fear, ambition, or political frustration, Bellatrix seemed drawn naturally toward darkness itself. Those who knew her during her years at Hogwarts later described brilliance twisted by cruelty, intensity sharpened into obsession. She admired power absolutely and viewed mercy almost as weakness. When Voldemort rose during the 1970s, Bellatrix devoted herself to him completely, not merely as a political follower, something deeper than that. The Dark Lord became the center around which her entire identity revolved. His ideology, his approval, his vision of magical supremacy. Bellatrix surrendered herself to those things so fully that ordinary emotional attachments seemed to fade from her life entirely. Even her marriage to Rodolphus Lestrange appeared secondary beside her devotion to Voldemort. This made her particularly terrifying during the war. Other Death Eaters sometimes hesitated. Some feared capture or death. Others balanced loyalty to Voldemort against family obligations or personal ambition. Bellatrix rarely displayed such uncertainty. She embraced violence eagerly and viewed suffering almost reverently when inflicted in service of the Dark Lord's cause. By the final years of the war, her name alone inspired fear across Wizarding Britain. Then Voldemort fell. The sudden collapse of the Dark Lord's power shattered many of his followers immediately. Some fled into hiding. Others attempted to deny involvement entirely. Certain Death Eaters claimed they had acted under the Imperious Curse, insisting they had never willingly served Voldemort at all. Bellatrix never denied anything. Alongside Rodolphus Lestrange, Rabistan Lestrange, and Barty Crouch Jr., she participated in one final act of violence after Voldemort's disappearance. Desperate to discover the Dark Lord's location, and believing the Aurors Frank and Alice Longbottom possessed information, the group tortured them with the Cruciatus Curse until both victims suffered catastrophic psychological damage. The attack horrified Wizarding Britain even after years of war. Frank and Alice Longbottom had been respected Aurors, courageous defenders against Voldemort's forces. What happened to them felt particularly cruel, because it continued even after the war itself had supposedly ended. The torture was not strategic or necessary. It was driven by obsession and desperation. When Bellatrix and the others were finally captured, the Ministry ensured the trial became public. The courtroom atmosphere carried exhaustion more than triumph. Britain had survived the war, but only barely. Entire communities mourned losses. Ministry officials were emotionally drained. Fear still lingered beneath daily life because no one knew whether Voldemort might somehow return. Into that exhausted world came Bellatrix Lestrange in chains. Witnesses later remembered her appearance vividly, thin but proud. Dark hair wild around a pale face still carrying traces of aristocratic beauty beneath fanatic intensity. Even surrounded by auras, she appeared strangely fearless. Some observers expected prisoners accused of such terrible crimes to beg or protest innocence. Bellatrix laughed instead. During the trial, she showed no remorse for what had been done to the Longbottoms. More disturbingly, she spoke openly of loyalty to Voldemort, insisting the Dark Lord would rise again. While other captured Death Eaters distanced themselves from their former master, Bellatrix treated imprisonment almost as proof of devotion. It unsettled, even hardened Ministry officials. The sentence was inevitable. Azkaban awaited them all. The journey north across the sea marked the beginning of a transformation that would reshape Bellatrix forever. Even before the prison emerged fully through the fog, the Dementors sensed the emotional intensity radiating from the prisoners aboard the transport vessel. Guards later described the creatures gathering along the cliffs in unusual numbers as the boat approached the docks. Most prisoners entering Azkaban arrived consumed by fear. Bellatrix arrived consumed by hatred. Inside the prison, this distinction mattered enormously. The Dementors fed first upon ordinary happiness, warm memories, comfort, love, hope. Many prisoners weakened rapidly because they still carried enough humanity for the creatures to consume. Bellatrix possessed remarkably little warmth left inside her by the time she entered Azkaban. Much of her emotional world already revolved around obsession, violence, and fanatical devotion. The Dementors could not strip away what barely existed. That did not mean Bellatrix escaped suffering. Azkaban affected her profoundly, but differently from most prisoners. The years inside the fortress peeled away the last traces of restraint and ordinary social identity she still possessed. The elegant pure-blood witch who once moved through aristocratic gatherings gradually transformed into something harsher and almost feral. Yet beneath that deterioration, her loyalty survived. Guards reported hearing her whispering Voldemort's name repeatedly inside her cell during long nights while storms battered the fortress walls. Sometimes she spoke to him as though he stood beside her. Other times she argued with invisible enemies or laughed softly to herself while staring into darkness for hours. The prison did not erase Bellatrix's identity, it concentrated it. This deeply disturbed Azkaban's staff, because the prison was built upon the assumption that prolonged despair broke people eventually. Bellatrix seemed strengthened by suffering in strange ways. Every year inside the fortress appeared to sharpen her hatred further. The Dementors consumed her happiness, but rage remained untouched. And rage, unlike happiness, could sustain itself indefinitely. The Lestrange brothers deteriorated more visibly over time. Rodolphus and Rabistan gradually lost much of the arrogant composure they once carried during the war. Guards described them as hollow-eyed and physically weakened after years of imprisonment. Yet Bellatrix retained flashes of frightening emotional intensity even while the prison aged her. Her laughter became infamous inside Azkaban. Prisoners housed near her cell reportedly heard sudden bursts of high, cold laughter echoing through corridors at unpredictable hours. Some inmates found it more unsettling than the Dementors themselves, because it sounded so utterly disconnected from ordinary human emotion. Azkaban changed everyone, but Bellatrix changed in ways the prison itself seemed almost to encourage. The Dementors fed constantly upon the fortress population during those years following Voldemort's fall. Despair saturated every corridor. Many Death Eaters abandoned hope entirely once it became clear the Dark Lord had truly vanished. Some prisoners wept openly during the early years of imprisonment, before emotional exhaustion eventually numbed even grief itself. Bellatrix never surrendered hope. Not rational hope, perhaps, but fanatic conviction. This created an unusual form of resistance against the prison's psychological destruction. The certainty that Voldemort would someday return became the foundation holding her identity together, while other prisoners slowly dissolved into emptiness. Even when memories faded or blurred beneath Dementor exposure, devotion remained. The guards noticed that Bellatrix reacted violently whenever other prisoners spoke of Voldemort as dead. During rare moments of prisoner interaction, she reportedly attacked inmates verbally and physically, despite magical restraints if they mocked or dismissed the Dark Lord. It was as though acknowledging his defeat threatened the final structure preserving her sanity. Over time, Azkaban itself seemed to reshape around the war prisoners confined within it. Entire sections of the prison housed captured Death Eaters, creating concentrated pockets of bitterness, paranoia, and lingering dark magic. Guards walking those corridors often described overwhelming sensations of hostility, unlike anywhere else inside the fortress. Patronus charms flickered weaker there. Dementors gathered more heavily outside certain cells, and at the center of that atmosphere sat Bellatrix Lestrange. The prison reduced her physically. Years without sunlight left her skin ghostly pale. Malnutrition and constant cold thinned her body, until she resembled something carved from bone and shadow. Dark, tangled hair framed eyes that grew increasingly wild with time. But emotionally, she remained terrifyingly alive. This became one of Azkaban's darkest revelations. The prison did not necessarily destroy evil. Sometimes it merely stripped away everything except evil itself. Ministry officials preferred not to discuss this possibility publicly. To the wider wizarding world, Bellatrix Lestrange disappeared into Azkaban and became little more than a frightening memory from the war years. Parents spoke her name cautiously around children. Survivors of Voldemort's rise remembered the Longbottom torture with quiet horror. But most ordinary witches and wizards assumed Azkaban had neutralized her permanently. They imagined the prison as finality. Yet far out in the freezing northern sea, behind black stone walls dripping with cold moisture, Bellatrix endured year after year beside the endless sound of crashing waves and drifting dementors, waiting, believing, and somewhere deep within the fortress, beneath the silence and despair consuming so many others, a dangerous certainty remained alive inside her mind. The Dark Lord would return. When Sirius Black arrived at Azkaban, the wizarding world believed they already understood exactly what kind of man he was. Newspapers called him Voldemort's most dangerous remaining supporter. Ministry officials described him as unstable, brilliant, and violently loyal to the Dark Lord. Photographs circulated showing hollow-eyed survivors pointing toward the ruins of a London street where 13 people had died in a single explosion. At the center of the destruction stood Sirius himself, laughing while surrounded by bodies and smoke. To most of Wizarding Britain, the case appeared simple. James and Lily Potter were dead. Peter Pettigrew was dead. Voldemort had fallen. And Sirius Black, once trusted friend to the Potters, had betrayed them all before murdering Pettigrew publicly in the chaos that followed. The Ministry never even held a proper trial. That fact would haunt wizarding history later, but during those exhausted days after Voldemort's fall, few questioned it. The war had shattered the country emotionally. People wanted closure more than careful justice. Sirius Black came from the House of Black, a family already associated with dark magic and blood supremacy. He appeared guilty. He laughed at the scene of the crime. Witnesses believed they saw him murder Pettigrew, so the Ministry chained him and sent him north across the sea. The journey to Azkaban occurred beneath heavy autumn skies. Rain lashed the transport vessel, while freezing wind swept across dark water. Auras escorting Sirius reportedly expected rage or resistance from him during the crossing. Instead, he remained strangely detached, staring toward the sea in silence while Dementors gathered gradually around the prison docks ahead. The guards interpreted this numbness as madness. In truth, Sirius barely understood his own survival at that moment. James and Lily were dead. Peter had escaped by framing him for murder. Voldemort had destroyed nearly everyone Sirius loved. Grief, shock, and guilt hollowed him out long before the Dementors ever touched his mind. And yet inside that devastation remained one important truth. He knew he was innocent. That fact became the single thread preserving him through the years that followed. Most prisoners entering Azkaban eventually collapsed beneath Dementor exposure because guilt and despair overwhelmed them completely. Sirius certainly carried despair, but not guilt for the crimes imprisoning him. He blamed himself for persuading James and Lily to trust Pettigrew as secret keeper instead of himself, a mistake that indirectly led to their deaths. But he had not betrayed them. He had not murdered Pettigrew. Somewhere beneath all the grief remained certainty. The Dementors could not consume certainty as easily as happiness. Still, Azkaban nearly destroyed him. The early years blurred together beneath endless cold and silence. Sirius occupied a narrow cell overlooking black northern water, where waves crashed endlessly against cliffs below the fortress. Dementors drifted constantly through nearby corridors, dragging warmth and memory from every prisoner they passed. At first, Sirius relived the deaths endlessly, James laughing during happier years before the war, Lily standing beside Harry's crib, the terrible realization that Peter had betrayed them, the explosion on the London street, the sound of Pettigrew screaming before disappearing into sewer darkness. Over and over the memories returned beneath Dementor influence until time itself seemed meaningless. Many prisoners forgot who they were eventually. Sirius almost did. The prison reduced him physically with terrifying speed. Malnutrition and cold thinned his body until bones pressed sharply beneath pale skin. His dark hair grew long and tangled. Fingernails cracked against stone walls during nightmares. Guards passing his cell described him initially as one more broken prisoner among many. But Sirius possessed something unusual. Long before Azkaban, during his Hogwarts years, he had secretly become an animagus, alongside James Potter and Peter Pettigrew. He could transform into a large black dog at will, a magical ability never registered with the Ministry. That secret would eventually save his life. The Dementors sensed human emotion rather than animal consciousness fully. When Sirius transformed into his dog form deep inside the prison, the creature's influence weakened slightly. Not completely. The despair remained crushing even then. But the emotional intensity dulled enough for him to think more clearly during brief moments. Those moments kept him alive. As the years passed, Sirius developed routines around survival. He transformed whenever possible to preserve fragments of sanity. He repeated memories of James and Lily carefully, terrified that Azkaban might eventually erode them entirely. He counted days through tiny changes in light and weather beyond his cell window, because clocks meant nothing inside the fortress. Outside Azkaban, the wizarding world slowly moved on. Harry Potter became famous as the boy who lived. Voldemort's followers either hid, denied involvement, or vanished into prison cells throughout the fortress. New students arrived at Hogwarts who barely remembered the war years themselves. Entire generations grew up believing Sirius Black represented one of Voldemort's greatest supporters. Inside the prison, Sirius listened to distant waves and waited. The Dementors fed constantly upon the fortress population during those years after the war. Many prisoners deteriorated completely. Some died quietly inside cells after losing the will to continue living. Others retreated so deeply into madness they no longer recognized guards or neighboring inmates. Sirius observed all of it from behind hollow eyes. He understood gradually that Azkaban functioned less as punishment than erasure. The prison slowly removed everything human from those trapped inside it, until prisoners became little more than shells containing suffering. That realization frightened him more than the Dementors themselves, because he could feel it happening inside his own mind. Certain memories weakened over time despite his efforts. Voices blurred, faces faded around the edges. Some mornings, he woke unable to remember simple details from his childhood or Hogwarts years, until he forced himself carefully through them again, piece by piece. Only grief remained perfectly clear. The prison preserved pain with terrible precision. Years passed this way, beneath endless northern storms. Then, one quiet morning, inside his cell, Sirius saw a newspaper photograph that changed everything. Cornelius Fudge, then Minister for Magic, visited Azkaban during an inspection, and carried a copy of the Daily Prophet into the prison. Sirius barely paid attention initially. Newspapers inside Azkaban usually brought little except reminders of a world continuing without him. But one image caught his attention immediately, a family photograph from Egypt. The Weasley family stood smiling beneath bright sunlight during a vacation abroad after winning a ministry lottery prize. Most readers saw nothing unusual. Sirius saw Peter Pettigrew, tiny and disguised as a rat sitting comfortably upon Ron Weasley's shoulder. The realization hit him with almost physical force. Peter was alive. More importantly, Peter was close to Harry. For the first time in over a decade, something stronger than despair surged through Sirius's mind. Purpose, fear, determination. The Dementors sensed the emotional change immediately, but they misunderstood it. They fed upon happiness and hope, yet Sirius's emotions now centered upon urgency and rage. Harry remained in danger while Pettigrew lived freely beside him. That certainty shattered the numb routines keeping Sirius passive. Escape suddenly mattered. The prison had always considered escape impossible, because no human prisoner could survive both the Dementors and the Northern Sea. But Sirius possessed advantages the Ministry never knew existed. His animagus form weakened Dementor influence. A dog could slip through narrower spaces than a man. More importantly, dogs swam well. For weeks, perhaps months, Sirius planned silently while pretending continued deterioration. Guards barely noticed him anymore after years inside the prison. He appeared exactly like countless other broken inmates drifting slowly toward emotional death. Then, one stormy night, he transformed. The black dog slipped past guards, distracted by weather and confusion inside the fortress. Dementors sensed only weak animal emotion, rather than fully human consciousness, and failed to react quickly enough. Sirius squeezed through openings impossible for a human body, before reaching the outer prison grounds beneath freezing rain. Ahead stretched the North Sea. The water was deadly cold, even in calmer weather. Waves crashed violently against the cliffs, while storm winds battered the island. Human prisoners attempting escape would almost certainly drown within minutes. But Sirius no longer thought like an ordinary prisoner. He leapt into the sea. The swim nearly killed him regardless. Freezing water drained strength rapidly, while waves dragged him repeatedly beneath the surface. Yet Azkaban itself had already reduced his body so drastically that he appeared less threatening than a large starving stray dog once reaching the mainland. Muggles overlooked him. Ministry searches focused upon human escape routes rather than wandering animals. For the first time in centuries, a prisoner escaped Azkaban. The news shattered Wizarding Britain. Newspapers erupted with panic. Ministry officials could scarcely explain how the prison's most famous inmate had vanished from a supposedly inescapable fortress. Guards faced investigations. Dementor patrols intensified around the country. Ordinary witches and wizards locked doors nervously, while rumors spread through every magical community in Britain. Because if Sirius Black could escape Azkaban, then perhaps the prison was not invincible after all. Far out in the freezing northern sea, the Black Fortress still stood unchanged beneath drifting fog and crashing waves. Dementors continued gliding silently through its corridors, feeding upon despair exactly as they always had. But something fundamental had cracked. For the first time, Azkaban had failed. The morning after Sirius Black escaped Azkaban, the Ministry of Magic awoke to something it had not experienced in generations. Fear not of dark wizards alone, but fear of failure. The fortress in the North Sea had always existed as the final guarantee beneath wizarding law, Criminals might evade capture temporarily. Trials might become corrupted. Dark wizards might terrorize the country for years. But eventually, Azkaban waited for them all. Now one of its most infamous prisoners had simply vanished. Inside the ministry, panic spread quietly at first, through whispered conversations behind office doors and hastily delivered owls arriving before dawn. Senior officials demanded explanations from Azkaban guards who possessed none. Dementor patrol records were reviewed repeatedly. Security procedures were examined for signs of sabotage or outside assistance. Nothing made sense. Sirius Black had escaped a prison designed specifically to prevent escape. Worse still, he was not viewed merely as an ordinary criminal. To the wizarding public, Sirius remained Voldemort's most dangerous surviving supporter, a mass murderer responsible for betraying the Potters and killing Peter Pettigrew alongside 12 Muggles. The idea of such a man loose again terrified the country. Cornelius Fudge, serving as Minister for Magic, felt that terror personally. Unlike Barty Crouch Sr. during the war years, Fudge lacked the cold certainty of a wartime leader. He preferred stability, public reassurance, and the careful maintenance of appearances. Sirius Black's escape threatened all three simultaneously, because if Azkaban could fail once, perhaps it could fail again. Newspapers exploded with speculation almost immediately. The Daily Prophet printed enormous moving photographs of Sirius's gaunt prison face across front pages, while headlines described him as highly dangerous and potentially insane after years inside Azkaban. Articles reminded readers repeatedly that Black had once been close to Voldemort himself, emphasizing his intelligence and unpredictability. The Ministry encouraged this narrative deliberately. Fear kept the public obedient. Yet beneath official announcements, genuine uncertainty spread among magical authorities. No one understood exactly how Sirius escaped. Dementors were supposedly impossible to deceive. Apparition could not function inside the prison. The surrounding sea should have killed any fleeing prisoner long before reaching shore. And still, Sirius Black was gone. The panic reached Hogwarts particularly quickly because Harry Potter attended the school. Ministry officials believed Sirius sought Harry specifically, imagining some final revenge connected to Voldemort's defeat. Albus Dumbledore questioned this assumption privately, but few listened carefully during those frightened months. Instead, the Ministry turned increasingly toward the Dementors themselves. The creatures had failed at Azkaban, so officials decided to deploy more of them elsewhere. Dementor patrols spread across Britain, searching for Sirius. Entire villages reported seeing dark, hooded figures gliding silently through streets and train stations, while temperatures dropped suddenly around them. The creatures boarded Hogwarts express carriages during inspections, causing widespread terror among students who had never encountered Dementors before. Many adults defended these measures despite growing discomfort. Fear changes what societies are willing to tolerate. The Ministry insisted the Dementors remained under control, though even experienced officials privately admitted the creatures seemed increasingly restless since Sirius's escape. Azkaban had always contained them within the isolated northern fortress, where despair remained concentrated and manageable. Now large numbers drifted freely across Britain, hunting a fugitive the Ministry desperately needed captured. The emotional atmosphere surrounding the country darkened noticeably. Reports increased of ordinary witches and wizards experiencing unexplained depression after encountering Dementor patrols. Shops closed earlier in certain districts because people feared walking streets after sunset. Conversations lowered whenever Sirius Black's name appeared. Children overheard frightened adults discussing Azkaban in tones usually reserved for war memories. Meanwhile, inside the prison itself, conditions worsened. The Dementors reacted badly to failure. Guards stationed at Azkaban during the months after Sirius's escape later described the creatures becoming unusually aggressive even toward prison staff. Patronus charms weakened faster than before. Entire sections of the fortress grew almost unbearably cold. Prisoners, already hanging barely onto sanity, collapsed more rapidly beneath intensified Dementor activity. It was as though the prison itself had become unstable. Some ministry officials began quietly questioning whether the creatures truly remained controllable at all. Sirius's escape exposed an uncomfortable truth buried beneath centuries of confidence. The ministry had built its entire prison system upon beings it fundamentally did not understand. Dementors obeyed only so long as obedience benefited them. That realization frightened certain members of the Wizengamot deeply, though few spoke publicly about it. The wizarding public needed reassurance, not philosophical uncertainty regarding prison security. Fudge especially became obsessed with projecting confidence despite mounting private anxiety. The minister visited Hogwarts personally before Harry's third year began, warning teachers and students alike about Sirius Black's supposed danger. Additional Dementors were stationed around the school grounds, despite Dumbledore's visible disapproval. Hundreds of students suddenly found themselves living beneath the watch of creatures designed originally to guard Azkaban itself. The emotional consequences became visible almost immediately. Many students experienced nightmares, panic attacks, or overwhelming sadness after close encounters with the creatures. But Harry Potter reacted more strongly than anyone else. Whenever Dementors approached him, he heard fragments of his parents' final moments during Voldemort's attack years earlier. Their voices echoed through his mind with unbearable clarity beneath the creature's influence. This reaction fascinated Professor Remus Lupin quietly. Lupin understood something most others did not. Dementors did not create fear artificially. They exposed existing wounds buried inside memory itself. Harry suffered more because he carried deeper trauma than many around him realized. The same principle explained Azkaban. The prison functioned by turning memory into punishment. Lupin began teaching Harry the Patronus charm, partly as practical defense against the Dementors surrounding Hogwarts. But those lessons also revealed important truths about the creatures themselves. Producing a Patronus required focusing intensely upon genuine happiness, something difficult even under ordinary circumstances, and nearly impossible beneath Dementor influence. The charm represented resistance through memory rather than force. Silver Patronuses became symbols of emotional survival against despair. This contrasted sharply with the Ministry's approach. Officials relied increasingly upon the Dementors themselves, despite growing evidence of danger. Every failure prompted demands for more patrols, stricter security, harsher measures. Few paused to ask whether relying upon creatures feeding on misery might eventually poison wizarding society itself. Dumbledore understood this danger clearly. He warned repeatedly that Dementors should never be trusted fully. They possessed no loyalty to human law or morality. They served only hunger. Yet frightened governments often ignore uncomfortable wisdom during moments of crisis, and Wizarding Britain remained deeply frightened. Rumors spread constantly throughout the country during Sirius's months on the run. Some claimed he hid inside Hogwarts itself. Others insisted Voldemort had secretly returned and orchestrated the escape. Certain former Death Eaters reportedly fled abroad, temporarily, fearing Black might seek revenge for past betrayals. The uncertainty exhausted everyone emotionally. Ordinary witches and wizards grew accustomed to seeing Dementors near train stations, villages, and ministry checkpoints. Children learned quickly to recognize the sudden, unnatural cold, signaling their approach. Conversations about Azkaban increased everywhere because Sirius's escape transformed the prison from distant nightmare into immediate political reality. People began asking questions they had avoided for generations. How could a prisoner survive inside Azkaban for so many years without completely losing sanity? What exactly did the Dementors do to inmates? If one prisoner escaped successfully, could others follow? The Ministry answered these questions poorly. Official statements emphasized security improvements and ongoing search efforts while avoiding deeper discussion entirely. Yet silence often feeds anxiety more effectively than truth. Public imagination filled gaps with increasingly terrifying possibilities. Meanwhile, Sirius himself moved through Britain, hidden between forests, caves, and abandoned buildings, while avoiding Dementor patrols searching constantly for him. The prison had transformed him physically beyond recognition. Years inside Azkaban left him skeletal and hollow-eyed, more resembling a starving ghost than the charismatic young wizard once known at Hogwarts. But emotionally, something remarkable had occurred. Unlike most prisoners, Sirius emerged from Azkaban still capable of purpose. That fact alone exposed the prison's greatest weakness. The Dementors could consume happiness, but not every human emotion collapsed equally beneath despair. Obsession, guilt, rage, love, and determination sometimes survived even when joy vanished entirely. Azkaban was not perfect. The fortress depended upon assumptions about human psychology that Sirius Black unintentionally disproved through survival itself. And far out in the freezing northern sea, beneath endless grey skies and drifting fog, the prison continued standing against the waves, while the wizarding world slowly realized something deeply unsettling. The darkness locked inside Azkaban had never truly been contained as securely as everyone wanted to believe. Among the many prisoners sent to Azkaban after the First Wizarding War, few stories revealed the hidden corruption surrounding the prison more clearly than that of Barty Crouch Jr. His imprisonment appeared, at first glance, to represent one more victory for the Ministry during the shattered aftermath of Voldemort's fall. Another captured Death Eater, another dangerous young wizard condemned to disappear behind the fortress walls forever. But beneath the official story lay secrets that would remain hidden for years. Barty Crouch Jr. grew up beneath enormous expectations. His father, Barty Crouch Sr., stood among the most powerful officials in the Ministry of Magic during the war years. Brilliant, disciplined, and fiercely ambitious, Crouch Sr. dedicated his life almost entirely to law enforcement and the destruction of Voldemort's followers. He demanded perfection from himself and expected no less from his son. The result was a household defined more by pressure than warmth. Little is known publicly about Barty Jr.'s childhood, though fragments later suggested isolation beneath his father's rigid standards. Crouch Sr. valued achievement, obedience, and reputation above emotional closeness. Ministry duties consumed most of his attention, while the war intensified around Britain. His son grew up in enormous shadow, constantly measured against impossible expectations. And somewhere during those years, something inside the younger Barty drifted toward darkness. Whether he genuinely believed in Voldemort's ideology or merely craved significance remains difficult to know entirely. But by the final stages of the war, Barty Crouch Jr. had become involved with Bellatrix Lestrange and other fanatical Death Eaters, searching desperately for their vanished master. The attack upon Frank and Alice Longbottom sealed his fate. When Aurors finally captured the group responsible for torturing the Longbottoms into insanity, Wizarding Britain reacted with horror and fury. The war had already devastated countless families, but the Longbottom attack felt especially monstrous because it occurred after Voldemort's apparent defeat. It seemed proof that certain followers remained dangerous beyond reason. The Ministry demanded punishment quickly. The trial became one of the most emotionally charged proceedings of the post-war years. Members of the Wizengamot filled the courtroom beneath cold torchlight, while reporters crowded the upper galleries, hoping to glimpse the captured Death Eaters. Bellatrix Lestrange entered defiant and unrepentant, as always. Rodolphus and Rabistan appeared exhausted, but still dangerous. Barty Crouch Jr. looked terrified. That detail would later haunt many who witnessed the proceedings. Unlike Bellatrix, the young wizard seemed overwhelmed by the reality surrounding him. Witnesses remembered pale skin, trembling hands, and desperate appeals directed toward his father, seated high among Ministry officials. He insisted repeatedly that he had not participated willingly, that he had been caught alongside dangerous people, but did not deserve Azkaban. Some believed him. Others dismissed the performance as manipulation. The courtroom atmosphere allowed little space for uncertainty regardless. Wizarding Britain wanted justice. More accurately, it wanted visible punishment severe enough to reassure a frightened society still recovering from war. The Longbottom attack demanded consequences, and the sight of Barty Crouch Sr. sentencing his own son carried enormous symbolic weight for the Ministry. Duty above family, law above emotion. When the sentence to Azkaban was announced, Bellatrix laughed proudly while proclaiming loyalty to Voldemort. Barty Jr. screamed for mercy. His father never intervened. The journey north shattered what remained of the young man's composure. Guards escorting the prisoners later described Barty Jr. as nearly hysterical upon first seeing Azkaban emerge from the fog, while Bellatrix stared toward the fortress with cold intensity. He reportedly begged repeatedly not to be taken inside. The Dementors sensed his fear immediately. Inside the prison, Barty Crouch Jr. deteriorated rapidly. Unlike Bellatrix, he possessed no fanatical certainty strong enough to anchor identity against the Dementor's influence. Azkaban consumed him with terrifying speed. The creatures fed endlessly upon terror, regret, loneliness, and emotional collapse, until the young wizard seemed almost physically drained of life itself within months. His mother visited whenever permitted. Mrs. Crouch rarely appeared publicly during the war years, existing mostly in quiet contrast to her husband's rigid political life. Where Barty Sr. valued control and reputation, his wife seemed motivated almost entirely by love for her son. Visiting Azkaban devastated her emotionally. Guards later recalled seeing her emerge from the fortress, pale and trembling, after encounters with the Dementors. Each visit revealed Barty Jr. weaker than before. The prison aged him unnaturally. His face became gaunt beneath hollow eyes, while despair hollowed out whatever youthful arrogance or rebellion once existed. The Dementors stripped away identity piece by piece, until he resembled countless other broken prisoners scattered throughout the fortress. Mrs. Crouch eventually realized her son would die there. That realization led to one of the most extraordinary deceptions in modern wizarding history. As illness consumed her body, during the years following the war, she convinced her husband to attempt something impossible. Barty Crouch Sr. resisted initially. Publicly, he remained the embodiment of ministry law and discipline. Privately, however, Azkaban had begun eroding him as well, not through Dementor exposure, through guilt. He had sent his own son to the prison without hesitation, while the country watched approvingly. At the time, it seemed necessary, perhaps even righteous. But years passed, and certainty weakened. Each ministry report from Azkaban describing his son's condition forced Crouch Sr. to confront something painful. Beneath politics and public image, Barty Jr. remained his child. Eventually, he agreed. The plan relied upon polyjuice potion and extraordinary secrecy. During one final authorized visit to Azkaban, Mrs. Crouch exchanged appearances with her son. Weak from illness and hidden beneath magical disguise, Barty Jr. escaped the prison disguised as his mother while she remained behind in his place. The Dementors never noticed. That fact revealed something chilling about Azkaban itself. The creatures did not recognize individual human identity properly. They sensed emotional states, despair, fear, and consciousness rather than faces. A dying woman filled with grief felt little different from a dying young prisoner beneath their influence. Mrs. Crouch died shortly afterward inside the prison while disguised as her son. The ministry buried her believing Barty Crouch Jr. had perished in Azkaban. Only a handful of people ever knew the truth. Outside the prison, Crouch Sr. hid his surviving son beneath the imperious curse inside the family home. Publicly, he allowed the world to believe Barty Jr. dead, while maintaining his reputation as uncompromising defender of magical lore. The secrecy consumed him gradually. Every aspect of the deception revealed uncomfortable truths about wizarding justice during those years. The ministry that publicly celebrated Azkaban's absolute security failed to notice a prisoner substitution directly beneath the Dementor's watch. The prison that supposedly represented perfect punishment became vulnerable to hidden political influence and desperate private manipulation. And perhaps most disturbingly, the entire system depended upon silence. Ordinary witches and wizards never learned what truly happened. They believed Barty Crouch Jr. died inside Azkaban as punishment for monstrous crimes. The ministry preferred that version because it preserved public faith in both the prison and the legal system surrounding it. Reality was messier. A grieving mother sacrificed herself inside one of the darkest places in the wizarding world, while powerful officials concealed the truth to protect reputations and maintain political stability. Meanwhile, Azkaban continued operating exactly as before. Prisoners screamed through endless nights, while Dementors glided silently through corridors feeding upon despair. Guards carried Patronuses through freezing hallways, already forgetting what ordinary happiness felt like. New inmates arrived constantly beneath northern storms, believing themselves abandoned forever. And hidden among all that suffering remained countless secrets the ministry preferred never to examine too closely. Because Azkaban functioned best when people imagined it simple, a prison for the guilty, a fortress protecting society, a final destination for monsters. But the story of Barty Crouch Jr. revealed something far more complicated beneath the cold stone walls and drifting Dementors. The prison did not exist outside human weakness. Politics entered Azkaban. Corruption entered Azkaban. Grief entered Azkaban. Love entered Azkaban too. And sometimes, hidden beneath all the despair, those human emotions proved strong enough to break the rules the fortress was built upon. For many years after Voldemort's fall, the Ministry of Magic convinced itself that the Dementors remained loyal. The creatures guarded Azkaban. They patrolled prison corridors. They assisted in searches for escaped prisoners like Sirius Black. Officially, the arrangement between wizarding government and Dementors remained stable despite occasional unease. But stability built upon fear rarely lasts forever. The truth was simpler and far more dangerous than most ministry officials wanted to admit. Dementors did not serve the ministry because they respected wizarding law. They served because Azkaban fed them endlessly. The prison provided a concentrated source of despair, unlike anywhere else in Britain, and the ministry allowed the creatures to feed without interruption for generations. It was never obedience, only convenience. Albus Dumbledore understood this more clearly than almost anyone else. He warned repeatedly that Dementors could not truly be trusted because they possessed no morality at all. They were not evil in the same way dark wizards were evil. Evil still implied choice, intention, belief. Dementors functioned more like natural disasters shaped into living forms. They drifted towards suffering instinctively and consumed human happiness because hunger demanded it. Eventually, something even more nourishing than Azkaban appeared within the wizarding world once again. Lord Voldemort returned. At first, only whispers spread through magical Britain. Strange disappearances, disturbances around old Death Eater strongholds, rumors from frightened ministry employees about unexplained magical activity. Most officials refused to acknowledge the possibility seriously because accepting Voldemort's return meant admitting the previous war had never truly ended. Cornelius Fudge especially resisted the truth. The minister feared panic more than darkness itself. Publicly recognizing Voldemort's return threatened not only political stability, but the ministry's entire image of control. For months, officials denied warnings from Harry Potter and Dumbledore, despite mounting evidence. Meanwhile, the Dementors watched. The creatures sensed emotional shifts spreading across Britain, long before ordinary witches and wizards fully understood what was happening. Fear deepened across the country. Anxiety saturated ministry offices. Old war trauma resurfaced among survivors who remembered the terror of Voldemort's first rise. To Dementors, these emotions were irresistible. At Azkaban, guards reported increasingly strange behavior among the prison's Dementor population during this period. The creatures gathered more densely along outer walls, overlooking the sea. Patronus charms weakened unpredictably during routine patrols. Some guards experienced sudden, overwhelming despair, even in previously safe sections of the fortress. The prison itself seemed restless, and deep inside certain cells, imprisoned Death Eaters sensed change approaching. Bellatrix Lestrange remained among the most dangerous prisoners confined within Azkaban during these years. The prison had transformed her physically into something skeletal and almost ghost-like, but emotionally, she remained terrifyingly intact. Years of suffering beneath Dementor exposure had stripped away nearly everything except devotion to Voldemort. When rumors of the Dark Lord's return began spreading quietly through prison corridors, Bellatrix reportedly became almost euphoric. Other Death Eaters reacted similarly. Some prisoners who had spent years silent and broken suddenly regained fragments of energy and focus. Guards noticed inmates whispering excitedly through cell walls during the rare moments when Dementors drifted elsewhere. The emotional atmosphere inside Azkaban shifted subtly from hopelessness toward anticipation. The Dementors noticed that change too. Then came the moment when the fragile alliance between ministry and creatures finally shattered. The Dementors abandoned Azkaban. Not all at once, perhaps, but decisively enough to transform the prison overnight. The creatures no longer saw benefit in serving frightened ministry officials desperately denying reality. Voldemort offered something far more attractive: chaos, terror, war. Entire populations living beneath spreading despair. Azkaban suddenly seemed small compared to what the Dark Lord could unleash across Britain. The Ministry received reports gradually at first, Dementor patrols failing to respond properly, creatures ignoring commands from prison guards, entire sections of Azkaban becoming difficult to monitor because the Dementors moved unpredictably through corridors without following established routines. Then prisoners began escaping. The breakout shocked Wizarding Britain almost as deeply as Sirius Black's escape years earlier, but for entirely different reasons. Sirius had represented one impossible prisoner, escaping alone through extraordinary circumstances. This time, Azkaban itself effectively changed sides. Bellatrix Lestrange escaped alongside numerous other Death Eaters once considered securely imprisoned forever. The details remained chaotic. Some guards fled. Others attempted resistance using Patronus charms that proved increasingly ineffective against enormous concentrations of Dementors, no longer cooperating with Ministry authority. Certain prisoners reportedly walked almost unchallenged through sections of the fortress because the creatures guarding them simply drifted aside. For the first time in centuries, Azkaban stopped functioning as a prison entirely. The emotional impact upon Wizarding Britain was catastrophic. Newspapers exploded with panic as names from the First Wizarding War suddenly returned to public consciousness. Bellatrix Lestrange, Antonin Dolohov, Augustus Rookwood. Witches and wizards, once associated with torture, murder, and dark magic, were loose again after years inside the fortress. And perhaps worst of all, the Ministry could no longer pretend control remained intact. Ordinary magical families reacted with quiet terror. Parents who survived Voldemort's first rise suddenly found themselves reliving old nightmares while trying to reassure children too young to understand fully what was happening. Protective charms appeared around homes across Britain. Travel declined sharply. Shops closed earlier. Fear spread exactly as Voldemort intended. The Dementors helped accelerate that fear naturally. Freed from Ministry restrictions, the creatures drifted across the countryside in increasing numbers, feeding upon the growing despair surrounding the war's return. Entire villages reported unnatural cold settling over streets before Dementors appeared. Depression and hopelessness increased noticeably, even among witches and wizards who never encountered the creatures directly. It was as though Azkaban itself had spilled outward into the world. The Ministry responded desperately but ineffectively. Officials who once defended reliance upon Dementors now faced humiliating reality. The creatures had never belonged to them at all. Generations of magical government had built national security around beings loyal only to suffering. Now that loyalty belonged to Voldemort instead. Dumbledore had warned of this for years. The Dark Lord understood the Dementors instinctively because he understood fear as power. He did not attempt to control the creatures through laws or agreements. He simply created conditions they desired naturally: war, despair, violence, hopelessness. Wherever Voldemort's influence spread, Dementors gathered willingly, and Britain was becoming saturated with fear again. Inside the abandoned sections of Azkaban, remaining guards struggled merely to survive. Certain prisoners, too weak or unimportant to join the breakout, remained trapped inside the fortress amid total chaos. The prison that once symbolized absolute Ministry authority suddenly resembled ruins reclaimed by darkness. Reports from those final days described corridors empty, except for drifting fog and distant screams. Patronus charms flickered weakly against massive concentrations of Dementors moving freely through the fortress. Some guards reportedly became trapped for days before rescue teams arrived, because magical communication systems failed beneath overwhelming creature activity. The island returned briefly to something closer to its original nature under Echrisdis, not a prison controlled by wizarding law, a place where despair ruled entirely. Bellatrix Lestrange emerged from Azkaban, transformed but unbroken. Years of imprisonment had sharpened her fanaticism into something almost religious. Thin, pale, and half feral from long exposure to Dementors, she returned to Voldemort with absolute devotion intact. The prison had not destroyed her loyalty, it had purified it. Other escaped Death Eaters varied in condition. Some appeared emotionally unstable after years beneath Dementor exposure. Others displayed frightening numbness toward violence and suffering. Azkaban had damaged them all psychologically, but the return of Voldemort gave many former prisoners renewed purpose strong enough to override fear. And so, the prison that once existed to contain darkness instead released it back into the world. This realization haunted many Ministry officials privately during the Second Wizarding War. Azkaban had never solved the problem of evil within magical society. It merely buried suffering beneath cold stone walls and drifting Dementors until circumstances changed. Now the consequences returned in full. Far out in the freezing northern sea, beneath endless grey skies and crashing waves, the Black Fortress still stood against the cliffs. But the illusions surrounding it had collapsed forever. The Ministry no longer controlled the darkness inside Azkaban. Perhaps it never truly had. To understand what Azkaban truly was, it was not enough to study trials, escapes, or famous prisoners. Those stories belonged mostly to the outside world, to newspapers and Ministry records and frightened conversations spoken beside warm fireplaces far from the northern sea. The real truth of Azkaban existed inside the cells themselves, in the endless hours where prisoners sat alone, listening to waves crash against stone, while Dementors drifted silently through the darkness. Most witches and wizards never saw the inside of the prison. They imagined chains, locked doors, and guards carrying wands through narrow corridors. Those things existed, certainly, but Azkaban's true horror was quieter than ordinary violence. The prison did not rely primarily upon physical pain. It hollowed people out slowly from within, until even memory itself became unbearable. The days inside the fortress blurred together almost immediately. Prisoners woke in cold darkness because sunlight rarely reached the cells properly. Small windows, positioned high within thick stone walls, admitted only pale grey fragments of northern daylight, and during storms, even that disappeared completely. Some prisoners later claimed they lost all understanding of morning and evening after only weeks inside. Time stopped moving normally in Azkaban. Hours stretched endlessly, while months vanished unnoticed. The cold never left. Not ordinary winter cold that scarves and blankets could resist, but something deeper that seemed to settle inside bones and thoughts alike. The Dementors carried freezing emptiness wherever they drifted, and the prison remained filled with them constantly. Stone walls sweated with moisture from the surrounding sea air, while dampness crept through blankets, clothing, and skin, until prisoners felt permanently chilled no matter how tightly they wrapped themselves. The silence became almost as painful as the cold. Human beings are not meant to live without ordinary sound. Outside Azkaban, even loneliness usually contains small comforts: wind through trees, distant conversation, birds calling overhead, the soft movements of other lives continuing nearby. Inside the fortress, those things vanished almost completely. There were only certain sounds: water dripping steadily through old pipes and cracks in stone, waves crashing endlessly against the cliffs below, occasional footsteps from guards moving quickly through corridors, and sometimes, far away in the darkness, screaming. Many prisoners described hearing cries echoing through the prison during storms, though it was often impossible to know whether the sounds came from actual inmates or simply memories amplified by the fortress itself. Azkaban played strange tricks upon the mind after prolonged exposure. Shadows moved incorrectly. Familiar thoughts became difficult to hold on to. Sleep and waking blurred together until nightmares seemed no different from ordinary consciousness. And through everything drifted the Dementors. Prisoners learned to sense them before seeing them. The air changed first. Warmth vanished. Breathing became heavier somehow, as though invisible water filled the lungs. Then emotions began collapsing inward. Hope weakened. Happy memories slipped away suddenly beyond reach. Finally came the rattling breath. Every prisoner feared that sound. The creatures moved silently, except for that terrible inhalation, slow and wet and hollow beneath their dark hoods. Some inmates curled into corners whenever Dementors approached the cells. Others screamed or begged, despite understanding the creatures could not be reasoned with. A few simply stared blankly, because the prison had already consumed too much emotion for panic to remain possible. The Dementors fed carefully. They did not merely cause sadness. They forced prisoners back toward the worst moments of their lives again and again, until those memories overwhelmed everything else. Shame became stronger than love. Regret became stronger than identity. Grief swallowed every remaining source of comfort. A prisoner who once cherished childhood memories might eventually remember only the death of a parent. Someone who once loved Quidditch, or music, or friendship would find those joys fading, while humiliation and terror remained vivid with terrible clarity. This process happened slowly enough that many prisoners barely noticed at first. One day, they realized they could no longer remember the sound of their mother's voice properly. Weeks later, they struggled to picture a childhood bedroom clearly. Eventually, entire portions of life vanished beneath the weight of despair, while the worst experiences remained impossibly sharp. The prison taught inmates to fear memory itself. Certain prisoners developed rituals, trying to preserve fragments of identity against the Dementors' influence. Some repeated names endlessly beneath their breath. Others recited favorite books or old Hogwarts lessons from memory while pacing tiny cells. A few scratched dates into stone walls, desperately counting time, because losing track of days felt too much like disappearing entirely. Many failed regardless. Former guards later described prisoners sitting motionless for hours, staring at nothing, too emotionally exhausted even to speak. Others whispered continuously to unseen people from their past. Some forgot language almost completely after long enough exposure. And perhaps the cruelest part of Azkaban was that the prison rarely killed quickly. The Dementors preferred prolonged suffering. They fed endlessly upon despair, draining prisoners gradually rather than all at once. Many inmates survived for years inside the fortress, while emotionally collapsing piece by piece. Death usually arrived quietly afterward through illness, exhaustion, or simple surrender. The ministry rarely spoke publicly about such realities. Officially, Azkaban represented justice and security, but those who worked there understood something different. The prison damaged everyone who entered it, even temporarily. Guards developed depression after prolonged assignments. Healers treating released prisoners encountered trauma unlike ordinary magical injury. Some survivors never truly returned emotionally from the island. When prisoners were occasionally released after serving shorter sentences, families often struggled to recognize them properly. Former inmates emerged pale and hollow-eyed, moving through ordinary life with visible uncertainty, as though warmth itself felt unfamiliar. Food tasted dull. Crowded rooms became overwhelming. Laughter sounded strange after years spent hearing only waves and screams. Many could no longer experience happiness normally. This frightened healers profoundly because magical medicine offered few solutions. Dementor damage resembled wounds inflicted directly upon the soul rather than body or mind alone. Patronus therapy sometimes helped slightly, surrounding survivors with concentrated positive emotion for brief periods, but certain scars remained permanent. One former prisoner reportedly sat silently beside a fireplace every evening for the rest of his life, simply watching flames, because Azkaban had left him terrified of darkness. Another could not sleep unless windows remained open, because the prison walls haunted his dreams decades afterward. Even short imprisonment changed people forever. And still, the Ministry continued defending the system because fear made alternatives difficult to imagine. Dangerous dark wizards existed. Violent magical criminals needed containment. Azkaban remained effective at preventing escape and terrifying potential offenders, but effectiveness carried hidden cost. The prison taught wizarding society that despair itself could become acceptable punishment. This idea seeped quietly into public consciousness over generations. Ordinary witches and wizards stopped questioning Dementors because the creatures existed conveniently far away on an isolated island. Suffering remained abstract when hidden behind cold stone walls and northern fog, yet prisoners experienced that suffering intimately every moment. Storms were often the worst times inside Azkaban. Northern tempests battered the fortress with incredible force, while waves exploded against cliffs below the prison towers. Wind howled endlessly through narrow corridors, carrying sea spray deep into the cells. During such nights, the Dementors grew particularly active, drifting in greater numbers through the fortress, while despair thickened almost physically in the air. Prisoners later described feeling as though the entire island fed upon them together. Sleep became nearly impossible during storms. Memories sharpened painfully beneath intensified Dementor presence. Some inmates screamed through entire nights, reliving moments of grief or terror over and over, while guards hurried past beneath weak Patronus light, unwilling to linger near the suffering. The prison consumed human connection deliberately. Visits remained rare and tightly controlled, because prolonged emotional interactions attracted Dementors intensely. Families crossing the sea to see imprisoned relatives often returned devastated afterward. Some prisoners wept openly during visits before becoming emotionally numb once the Dementors drifted closer again. Others avoided visitors entirely because remembering love hurt too much afterward. Isolation protected the prison's power. Without connection, prisoners weakened faster. Without reminders of ordinary life, identity dissolved more easily. Azkaban functioned not merely by locking bodies away, but by convincing people they had already vanished from the world beyond the sea. And slowly, many prisoners began believing it themselves. Far out in the freezing North Sea, beneath endless grey skies and drifting fog, the fortress continued standing against the waves. While inside its cold corridors, countless witches and wizards sat alone, listening to the sound of water and forgetting, little by little, who they had once been. When the Second Wizarding War finally ended and Voldemort fell within the walls of Hogwarts, Wizarding Britain emerged exhausted in ways difficult to describe fully. The country had survived 2 wars within a single generation. Entire families carried scars from disappearances, betrayals, imprisonment, and grief stretching back decades. The Ministry of Magic itself stood deeply discredited after years of denial, corruption, and eventual collapse beneath Death Eater control. And far out in the North Sea, Azkaban still remained. The Black Fortress had survived everything: storms, wars, escapes, revolts, ministers rising and falling, generations of prisoners fading into despair behind its walls. The prison continued standing exactly where it always had, cold stone towers rising from jagged cliffs while waves crashed endlessly below. But something fundamental had changed after Voldemort's defeat. The Dementors were gone. For centuries, the creatures had defined Azkaban more than the fortress itself. They transformed imprisonment into psychological devastation. They turned the prison into a symbol feared across the wizarding world. Yet during Voldemort's rise, the Dementors revealed their true nature completely by abandoning the Ministry and joining the Dark Lord willingly. That betrayal destroyed whatever fragile trust still existed between wizarding society and the creatures. Kingsley Shacklebolt understood this immediately upon becoming Minister for Magic after the war. Unlike Cornelius Fudge, Kingsley possessed a calm practicality shaped by years as an aura during both peace and conflict. He had witnessed firsthand what fear did to governments and how desperation pushed institutions toward dangerous compromises. The Ministry's dependence upon Dementors represented one of those compromises. It would not continue under his leadership. Removing the creatures from Azkaban proved enormously difficult. Dementors did not obey ordinary commands, nor could they simply be arrested or imprisoned themselves. Ministry officials instead worked gradually to force the creatures away from populated magical areas through concentrated Patronus patrols and protective enchantments. Some Dementors drifted elsewhere across Europe afterward. Others vanished into isolated regions far from human communities. A few scholars quietly worried the creatures might eventually gather again, somewhere beyond Ministry observation. But they no longer guarded Azkaban. For the first time in centuries, silence inside the prison changed. Former guards returning after the war described the difference immediately. The fortress remained cold and unsettling, certainly. Echrizdis's ancient magic still lingered within the stone walls, and decades of suffering had left emotional scars upon the place itself. Yet without the Dementors constantly feeding upon despair, the prison felt strangely lighter somehow. Not safe, never truly safe, but no longer alive with hopelessness in quite the same terrible way. Kingsley ordered sweeping reforms throughout the prison system during the early post-war years. Conditions inside Azkaban improved slowly under new oversight. Cells were renovated to allow greater warmth and natural light wherever possible. Prisoners received more regular human interaction and proper medical care. Guard rotations shortened significantly to prevent emotional deterioration among staff. Most importantly, punishment no longer depended upon despair itself. This marked a profound philosophical shift within Wizarding Britain. For generations, the public accepted emotional destruction as normal because Dementors made it convenient. Now society faced difficult questions previously ignored. What should prison actually accomplish? Protection, punishment, rehabilitation? Could a place built upon suffering ever truly become humane? Opinions varied sharply. Some witches and wizards argued Azkaban should be destroyed entirely. Too much horror lingered there already. Too many innocent people suffered within its walls alongside the guilty. They believed the fortress itself remained corrupted beyond redemption after centuries of Dementor influence and Echrizdis's original crimes. Others insisted the prison remained necessary, despite its terrible history. Dangerous dark wizards still existed. Magical society still required secure containment for violent criminals. Destroying Azkaban without creating alternatives might expose future generations to catastrophic risk. Kingsley chose reform instead of destruction. The decision reflected practical reality as much as idealism. Rebuilding the entire wizarding prison system from nothing during post-war recovery would have overwhelmed ministry resources already strained by reconstruction efforts across Britain. Azkaban's isolation still offered security advantages impossible to ignore. But the prison's identity changed permanently once the Dementors disappeared. Former prisoners released during the Reformed era described conditions profoundly different from earlier decades. The fortress remained bleak and heavily guarded, yet ordinary human routines slowly returned to its corridors. Guards spoke openly with inmates rather than hurrying silently beneath Patronus protection. Meals arrived regularly without the suffocating emotional emptiness that Dementors created. And perhaps most importantly, prisoners could sleep without reliving their worst memories endlessly each night. The psychological atmosphere transformed gradually. Without Dementors feeding constantly upon despair, Azkaban stopped eroding identity in quite the same relentless manner. Prisoners still suffered isolation, regret, and fear. But those emotions remained recognizably human rather than amplified into unbearable supernatural torment. Some ministry healers described the difference as the prison becoming a place of confinement rather than annihilation. Yet the old scars remained everywhere. Certain corridors inside Azkaban still carried overwhelming sadness despite the reforms. Guards working night shifts occasionally reported hearing distant screams echoing faintly through empty sections of the fortress during storms. Some believed the stone itself retained emotional impressions from centuries of suffering beneath Dementor influence. Whether true or not, few people enjoyed spending unnecessary time there. The prison's reputation lingered powerfully even after reforms began. Older generations who survived the First and Second Wizarding Wars still associated Azkaban with hopelessness and terror. Parents continued lowering their voices when speaking its name around children. Former prisoners carried trauma that no ministry policy could erase simply because conditions improved afterward. Sirius Black never lived long enough to see these changes. Neither did many others destroyed emotionally or physically by the old prison system. Their suffering became part of Azkaban's permanent history, whether the ministry wished to acknowledge it openly or not. Kingsley understood this burden perhaps better than previous ministers. Unlike officials who viewed Azkaban merely as political necessity, he recognized the prison as evidence of how fear could distort entire societies. During Voldemort's rise, frightened governments repeatedly sacrificed morality for security until they barely recognized the darkness growing inside their own institutions. The Dementors symbolized that compromise perfectly. Wizarding Britain once believed despair could be controlled and weaponized safely against dangerous people. Instead, the creatures eventually sided openly with Voldemort because suffering itself remained their only true loyalty. Removing them from Azkaban became more than administrative reform. It became an admission. The old system had been wrong. Still, rebuilding trust proved far more difficult than changing policies. Many ordinary witches and wizards remained skeptical of reforms they viewed as excessive mercy toward criminals. Some argued the old Azkaban frightened dark wizards effectively and therefore prevented violence. Others quietly missed the emotional reassurance that came from believing terrible people suffered terribly behind distant walls. Fear leaves long shadows upon societies, yet there were signs of healing too. New generations of ministry employees assigned to Azkaban no longer developed the same profound depression once common among guards. Healers reported fewer cases of permanent psychological collapse among released prisoners. Families visiting inmates described an atmosphere still grim but recognizably human rather than soul-destroying. The sea remained unchanged around the island, Waves still battered black cliffs beneath endless northern skies. Fog still drifted across the water, thick enough to swallow entire boats from view. Storms still wrapped the fortress in rain and darkness for days at a time, while cold winds rattled ancient windows. Azkaban remained Azkaban, but inside its walls, something fragile had begun returning after centuries absent. Hope. Not easily, not completely, and certainly not without pain lingering everywhere beneath the surface. Yet prisoners could now imagine futures beyond the island again. Guards could walk corridors without feeling their happiest memories draining away piece by piece. The fortress no longer fed constantly upon human suffering, like a living parasite. Far out in the freezing North Sea, beneath grey skies and drifting fog, the ancient prison stood quietly against the waves while Wizarding Britain attempted, slowly and imperfectly, to become something better than the fears that had created Azkaban in the first place. By the time the Second Wizarding War ended, Azkaban had become more than a prison within the imagination of Wizarding Britain. It stood as a symbol carrying generations of fear, grief, punishment, and moral compromise layered one upon another, like the cold stones of the fortress itself. Even witches and wizards who never saw the island directly understood what its name meant instinctively. Azkaban represented the point where fear became policy. That transformation happened slowly enough that most people barely noticed it occurring. The prison began as an isolated fortress discovered beneath horrifying circumstances, a place already poisoned by a Christus long before the Ministry arrived. Yet instead of destroying the island after uncovering the suffering hidden there, Wizarding authorities chose to preserve and repurpose it. The decision seemed practical at first. Dangerous dark wizards existed. Magical criminals needed containment. The fortress offered natural isolation and impossible escape routes. The Dementors already inhabited the island. Using them as guards appeared efficient, even logical, to frightened officials facing centuries of magical conflict. But fear has always possessed a dangerous ability to disguise cruelty as necessity. The Ministry convinced itself that despair could become an acceptable instrument of justice, so long as it remained directed toward the guilty. Ordinary witches and wizards accepted this because Azkaban existed far away beyond the Northern Sea, hidden behind fog and guarded by creatures most people hoped never to encounter personally. Distance made suffering easier to tolerate. Over generations, the prison's emotional meaning expanded far beyond law enforcement itself. Parents frightened children by mentioning Azkaban because the prison symbolized ultimate exclusion from society. Newspapers invoked it whenever discussing dark magic because its name carried immediate emotional weight. Ministry officials relied upon public fear of the fortress to reinforce authority during times of instability. Azkaban became a shadow hanging permanently over Wizarding Britain. Yet beneath that symbolism lingered uncomfortable contradictions. The wizarding world often liked imagining itself morally superior to non-magical society. Wizards criticized Muggle violence, greed, and warfare, while viewing magic as evidence of greater wisdom or enlightenment. But Azkaban revealed how fragile that self-image truly was. Faced with fear, magical society embraced a prison powered literally by despair itself, not temporarily, for centuries. The Dementors represented this contradiction perfectly. They were not loyal guardians protecting justice. They were creatures feeding upon human suffering. The Ministry knew this from the beginning. Officials understood that prisoners emerged emotionally destroyed if they survived at all. Guards developed depression after prolonged exposure. Innocent people occasionally suffered alongside the guilty. And still the system continued, because fear made it feel necessary. This reflected one of the deepest themes running throughout wizarding history. Again and again, fear distorted institutions meant to protect people. During Voldemort's rise, the Ministry abandoned due process and imprisoned suspects rapidly because panic overwhelmed caution. Cornelius Fudge denied Voldemort's return because he feared instability more than truth itself. Death Eaters manipulated those weaknesses repeatedly because frightened societies become easier to control. Azkaban stood at the center of all those failures. The prison did not merely contain dark magic. It revealed how darkness entered ordinary systems gradually through compromise and rationalization. No single minister created Azkaban's horrors alone. Instead, generations of officials accepted small moral concessions until suffering itself became routine. The fortress taught Wizarding Britain to confuse punishment with justice. That distinction mattered deeply to Albus Dumbledore. Throughout his life, Dumbledore warned repeatedly about the dangers of governing through fear. He understood that societies become most vulnerable morally during moments of panic, when safety begins outweighing compassion or wisdom. The Dementors demonstrated this lesson clearly. The creatures could not distinguish between guilty and innocent emotions. They fed upon despair universally. A grieving prisoner, a terrified guard, a falsely accused inmate, a violent murderer, all suffered equally beneath their influence because the Dementors recognized only emotional hunger. Yet the Ministry continued using them anyway, because fear encouraged moral simplification. Bad people deserved terrible punishment. Dangerous criminals required absolute containment. The prison protected ordinary society. These ideas sounded reasonable until examined too closely. What happened to prisoners after years inside Azkaban? What remained of human identity once Dementors consumed every happy memory? Could justice truly exist inside a system designed around emotional annihilation rather than rehabilitation or understanding? Wizarding society rarely asked such questions publicly because answers threatened uncomfortable truths. Sirius Black exposed many of those truths simply by surviving. His imprisonment revealed how fear and political pressure could destroy innocent lives when governments prioritized certainty over fairness. The Ministry never gave him proper trial because the public wanted someone blamed quickly after Voldemort's fall. Azkaban made such mistakes permanent. Barty Crouch Jr.'s story revealed different corruption hidden beneath the prison system. Powerful officials manipulated truth secretly while maintaining public faith in Ministry authority. Families suffered quietly while political appearances remained protected. Bellatrix Lestrange demonstrated something even darker. The prison did not necessarily destroy evil. Sometimes it sharpened obsession into fanaticism by stripping away everything except hatred itself. And the Dementors eventually revealed the deepest flaw of all. The Ministry never controlled them. This truth shattered the symbolic meaning Azkaban held within wizarding society. For generations, the prison reassured frightened citizens that darkness remained contained behind cold stone walls far away beyond the sea. Then Voldemort returned, and the Dementors abandoned the Ministry almost immediately, because suffering itself mattered more to them than human law. Azkaban had always depended upon forces fundamentally incompatible with morality. The prison's collapse during the Second Wizarding War therefore felt almost inevitable in retrospect. A system built upon despair could not remain stable forever, because despair eventually spreads beyond intended boundaries. The Dementors left the island willingly, once greater fear appeared elsewhere across Britain. The darkness escaped because the darkness had never truly been imprisoned at all. Even after reforms removed the Dementors following Voldemort's defeat, Azkaban remained emotionally complicated within wizarding memory. The fortress still stood against the northern sea, carrying centuries of suffering inside its walls. New guards and prisoners entered a place shaped profoundly by grief long before they arrived. Can institutions built upon fear ever fully transform themselves? Wizarding Britain never answered that question completely. Kingsley Shacklebolt's reforms represented sincere attempts to create something more humane from the ruins of the old prison system. Conditions improved, Dementors vanished, prisoners regained fragments of dignity denied to earlier generations. Yet the island itself remained burdened by history impossible to erase entirely. The waves still crashed against the cliffs exactly as they always had. Fog still drifted across black stone towers, where countless prisoners once sat alone, forgetting the sound of laughter beneath Dementor influence. And somewhere within those corridors lingered memory. Not magical memory precisely, but cultural memory carried collectively by wizarding society itself. Azkaban reminded witches and wizards what happened when fear became more important than humanity. The prison stood as proof that ordinary people could normalize cruelty gradually, so long as they believed the victims deserved it. That lesson extended far beyond dark wizards or magical war, because the true danger of Azkaban was never merely the Dementors. It was how easily entire generations accepted them. After the fall of Voldemort and the removal of the Dementors, Azkaban entered the quietest period in its long history. The fortress still stood where it always had, isolated beneath grey northern skies, while cold waves struck the cliffs below with endless patience. Storms still rolled across the North Sea. Fog still swallowed the island for days at a time, until the prison seemed less like a real place and more like a shadow drifting at the edge of the world. But the silence inside the fortress had changed. For centuries, Azkaban's corridors carried a particular kind of emptiness created by the Dementors themselves. Their presence hollowed every sound, every thought, every memory. The prison once felt alive with despair, as though suffering moved through the stone walls like cold water through cracks. Now that feeling faded slowly, year by year. Guards walking night patrols after the reforms described hearing ordinary sounds returning to the prison for the first time. Conversations between inmates, the scrape of chairs against stone floors, quiet laughter drifting unexpectedly from distant corridors during rare moments of human warmth. These noises remained subdued, fragile almost. But they mattered because Azkaban had once devoured such things completely. The prison no longer fed upon happiness. Yet history lingered everywhere. Certain sections of the fortress remained permanently abandoned after the war, because too much suffering seemed trapped there still. Lower corridors, built originally by Akrisdis, carried oppressive silence, unlike anywhere else inside the prison. Even experienced auras avoided those chambers unnecessarily. Some swore the walls themselves retained emotional echoes from centuries of imprisonment beneath Dementor influence. Whether those feelings came from magic or memory hardly mattered. Azkaban remained haunted either way. The island itself seemed unchanged by reform. Black cliffs still rose sharply from violent northern water, while narrow windows stared outward across endless grey sea. The weather rarely softened. Rain swept across the fortress for weeks during winter months, and wind howled constantly through upper towers, carrying salt and cold into every corridor. It was difficult imagining any place less suited for human comfort. Perhaps that was why Azkaban endured despite everything. The prison's isolation remained psychologically powerful, even without Dementors. prisoners still understood they existed far removed from ordinary life, surrounded by freezing sea and impossible distance. Escape remained dangerous. Solitude remained immense. But there was a difference now between isolation and annihilation. That distinction mattered deeply to surviving prisoners released during the years after the war. Some emerged from Azkaban carrying emotional scars too deep for complete healing. Men and women imprisoned during the old Dementor era often struggled quietly through the rest of their lives. Certain memories never returned fully after prolonged exposure. Others returned too vividly. Nightmares remained common. Crowded rooms caused panic in some survivors because years spent inside isolated cells transformed ordinary human interaction into something overwhelming. Healers across Wizarding Britain slowly developed better understanding of this trauma over time. What Azkaban inflicted upon prisoners was not simple sadness or fear. It resembled damage to the soul's relationship with memory itself. Former inmates described feeling detached from happiness even years after release, as though joy belonged naturally to other people, but not to them anymore. Sirius Black's story became central to these conversations despite his death during the war. Many younger witches and wizards eventually learned the truth about his innocence and imprisonment. What once seemed merely tragic began representing something larger within public consciousness. Sirius became proof that fear and political pressure could destroy innocent lives when governments stopped valuing justice carefully enough. The Ministry never fully recovered morally from that revelation. Neither did Azkaban. Bellatrix Lestrange remained another kind of memory, attached permanently to the prison. Her madness, devotion, and eventual escape became symbols of how suffering alone could not destroy dangerous ideology. The prison had consumed years of her life without removing the darkness inside her. If anything, it sharpened it. This realization forced difficult questions upon post-war wizarding society. What should prisons accomplish? Was punishment enough? Could people truly change through suffering alone? Or did cruelty simply create deeper cruelty in return? No simple answers emerged. Kingsley Shacklebolt's reforms improved conditions enormously, but Azkaban could never entirely separate itself from its own history. Every corridor carried ghosts, invisible yet deeply felt. Not literal spirits, perhaps, though some guards quietly believed otherwise after lonely night shifts during storms. Rather, the prison carried accumulated human sorrow layered across centuries. Thousands of lives passed through those cells, some guilty, some innocent, most forgotten eventually by the wider world. The fortress remembered all of them. There were stories among newer guards about certain windows where prisoners once sat for years staring toward the sea in silence. Stories about abandoned cells that felt unnaturally cold despite the Dementor's absence. Stories about hearing distant footsteps in empty corridors during winter storms when the prison should have been sleeping. Few people discussed such things openly. Azkaban encouraged quietness, perhaps because silence became part of the island itself, long ago beneath Acrisdis and the Dementors. The prison always seemed to absorb human noise, eventually, until only waves and wind remained. Far from the fortress, Wizarding Britain rebuilt itself gradually after the war. Children returned to Hogwarts without fearing Death Eaters lurking nearby. Shops reopened fully in Diagon Alley. Families repaired homes and mourned losses while trying cautiously to imagine peaceful futures again. Yet Azkaban remained part of that future whether people liked it or not. The prison still housed dangerous witches and wizards. Dark magic did not vanish, simply because Voldemort died. Human fear, ambition, and cruelty continued existing exactly as before. Ministry officials understood another dark wizard might someday rise again, because history rarely ends as cleanly as stories prefer. And so, the fortress endured. Boats still crossed northern waters, carrying prisoners beneath heavy skies. Guards still walked stone corridors at night beneath flickering magical lamps. Storms still battered the island with ancient fury, while waves exploded against black cliffs below. But the prison no longer pretended despair itself was justice. That may have been the most important change of all. Older generations, who remembered the Dementors, sometimes spoke about Azkaban differently after the reforms. The fear remained, certainly. The fortress still symbolized punishment and isolation throughout wizarding society. Yet some of the deeper horror faded once the creatures disappeared. Children no longer grew up hearing stories about soul-draining monsters gliding through prison corridors. The island became a prison again, instead of something worse. Even so, there were moments when the old Azkaban seemed to linger just beneath the surface of the new one, particularly during storms. On certain winter nights, when rain lashed the towers and fog swallowed the sea entirely, guards reported feeling sudden, overwhelming sadness while walking alone through upper corridors. Not their own sadness exactly, something older, larger, as though centuries of grief remained embedded within the fortress walls, waiting quietly beneath the silence. Perhaps places remember suffering after enough time passes, or perhaps human beings simply cannot build prisons from despair without leaving permanent marks upon the world around them. Either way, Azkaban stood alone beneath the northern sky, carrying all its history inside black stone walls, weathered by endless storms and generations of fear. The prisoners came and went. Ministers rose and fell. Wars began and ended. But the island remained. And somewhere beyond the crashing waves and drifting fog, far from the warmth of ordinary life, the old fortress continued watching the sea in silence while the wizarding world slowly moved forward, carrying the memory of what had once happened inside Azkaban. And so, the fortress remained where it had always stood, alone beneath the grey skies of the North Sea, while waves rolled endlessly against black stone cliffs worn smooth by centuries of storms. Long after the Dementors vanished and the wars finally ended, Azkaban still carried the weight of every life that passed through its corridors. The prison had once been built upon fear, sustained by despair, and hidden behind the comforting belief that darkness could simply be locked far away from the rest of the world. But places like Azkaban leave marks that do not disappear easily, not upon stone, not upon memory, and not upon the people who survive them. Tonight, as the sea grows quieter and the distant towers fade gently back into the fog, let the cold corridors of the fortress drift slowly into silence once more. The guards continue their lonely patrols. The waves continue their endless rhythm beneath the cliffs. And somewhere beyond the northern mist, the wizarding world sleeps peacefully, hoping it will never again create another place quite like Azkaban.